It's starting here in this church, but this is going to end in Hollywood, and it's going to be big, really big. Friends, I'm having a problem. I keep suggesting to Linda that as part of this service I might sing a couple of songs, and whenever I do that, she keeps changing the subject. Okay, sound test. Joan Rivers asked, how many middle-aged men go out at night to get a quart of milk and never come back? Her answer, not enough. Once there were two retired pastors who were comparing notes about their days in the pulpit. One pastor said he always had trouble getting people to tithe and that his church had financial problems as a result. The other said, I solved that problem. I put electrodes in the pews. I'd say, will all those who agree to tithe please stand? And then I'd give them some juice. If anyone wouldn't stand, I'd just up the amount. Wow, great idea. How did it work? Well, okay, but the problem was I electrocuted two Scotsmen. John F. Kennedy was visiting Paris with his wife Jackie. A reporter from a French newspaper suggested in a press conference that Jackie, who had said that she enjoyed French wine, might be a problem drinker. John F. Kennedy was angry and hurt at this. Afterwards, he said to British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, what would you have said if a reporter asked if your wife was an alcoholic? Macmillan said, I would have replied, you should have seen her mother. One night a drunk was walking home and he took a shortcut through the cemetery. There was a dug grave there which he didn't see, and he stumbled into it. He scrambled up the wall and scrambled up the wall of the grave. He couldn't get out. And so he figured he'd just wait there till morning and then shout for help. As it turned out, a little later that same night, another drunk was walking through the cemetery and he fell into that same grave. He didn't see the first drunk who was sitting over in a dark corner, and he too scrambled up the wall and scrambled up the wall of the grave and couldn't get out. Then he heard a voice from the corner of the grave saying, you ain't ever getting out of here. But he did. One time a congressman had a heart attack on the floor of the House and he died. He hovered over his body for a while, watching the EMTs work on him. But the next thing he knew, he was at the pearly gates, standing in front of St. Pete. St. Peter was looking at his book, and he admitted he wasn't sure what to do with them. Well, on the one hand, you were very bad on the environment. On the other hand, you were very good to veterans. On the one hand, you were too cozy with fat cats and country club types. But on the other hand, you supported your local church. I mean, this really could go either way. Tell you what, why don't you look at both heaven and hell, and you tell me where you want to go. The elevator's over there. So the congressman took the down elevator, and it opened up in hell, and he saw a lot of his political friends there. They were playing golf. They welcomed him. They loaned him some clubs. Gee, he had a good round. The weather was fine. They went to the 19th hole. They had some drinks. Afterwards, he thought, what a good time. Thought, well, I should try out the other place too. So he took the elevator up to heaven, and it was nice. The angels were singing. The music was beautiful. Gardens were lovely. Everyone was very pleasant. But he didn't see anyone he knew, so he took the elevator back to the mezzanine and told St. Peter he was going to go to hell. St. Peter said, well, okay, remember, it's a one-way trip. No, that's what I want. All my friends are there. The congressman went down in the down elevator. It opened up in hell, and now it was black and hot, and every once in a while a demon would come by and hit him with a whip. The congressman said to his friends, hey, what happened to the golf course and the nice weather? Sorry about that, they said. Those were just campaign promises. I'll tell you a story from U.S. history. Richard Nixon once had an audience with Pope Paul VI at the Vatican. He was accompanied by Henry Kissinger and by Defense Secretary Melvin Laird, and also by various aides. Waiting outside, Laird had been smoking a cigar, but then the Pope's Swiss guard came out really quite suddenly and motioned for them to enter. And Kissinger hissed to Laird, "Get rid of that cigar." While they were inside, the Pope gave a brief address, and then smoke started coming out of Melvin Laird's coat pocket. Laird began slapping at his pocket like this, and Nixon's aides thought that this was the protocol for applause inside the Vatican, and they all started slapping their pockets as well. What the Pope made of all this is not recorded. I received a number of donations this last week in memory of Ellen Sawicki. One was from a friend of Ellen's who used to run a dance studio right here on Church Lane. This reminded me of something that happened to me 25 or 30 years ago. We had a vacation Bible school one summer. It ran every morning, Monday through Friday, for a week from 9 to 12:30, I think. We had several different classes, and I would take each one of them out for recess. One morning it was raining, and the owner of the dance studio here had told me that to feel free to use the studio in the morning if I like, since she only used it in the afternoon and evening for her classes. Her only request was that all the kids take off their shoes so as not to damage the floors. So I took a class of about 15 kids under the age of 6 there, and they took off their shoes, and we played Blind Man's Bluff and Duck, Duck, Goose and Time Bomb, when you hand a vegetable timer or a cooking timer around, and if it goes off, you pretend it's a bomb. After an hour or so of that, I was, as you can imagine, pretty tired, and we all got ready to go back here to the church. And the kids went over to their shoes. This was back before Velcro had been invented. And I discovered that none of them knew how to tie their shoes, and I had to tie the shoe of every single one of them. I remember once, years ago, I did a funeral at a funeral home in Norwich. Norwich is not a city I know well, and at the time it was a city I didn't know at all. I was following a young funeral director whom I had never worked with before or since. He was leading us from the funeral home in procession to Maplewood Cemetery. It's the one right next to 395. Funeral processions are supposed to move very slowly. It's very hard to get a bunch of cars between point A and point B, keep them together. This funeral director apparently had missed that class in mortuary school, and he took off like a rocket through these various back streets of Norwich. Nowadays, I simply would have let him go and found my way there via GPS. But when I was a young pastor, that hadn't been invented yet. And at the time, if I was to get to the cemetery, where of course I was supposed to do the committal service, I had to follow him. No one was stationed at any of the intersections. He would be roaring through them just as the light was turning yellow, and I'd be buzzing under a red light or going through a stop sign. And not surprisingly, we lost almost all of the procession. So we got there, and the funeral director signaled for me to begin. I ignored him and waited, and sure enough, various people in the procession who knew their way around Norwich began drifting in. He signaled me a little more impatiently to begin, and I could still see cars drifting in. So again, I waited, knowing that, unless he was packing a gun, he couldn't make me do a committal service. He was unarmed, and when it looked like everybody who was going to get there had gotten there, I did the burial rites. The other night on the TV, I was flipping through the channels, and I came across the car chase scene in the movie Bullet, and I thought of that drive through Norwich. I was in grad school in the middle 1980s, and we were visited by a professor from Poland who was an expert in various obscure languages, one of which I was studying at the time. And we spent a long afternoon examining grammatical points in this language. Only once in my life have I been as bored as I was on this occasion, and that was when I took Violetta to a bridal shower sponsored by the Filipino community in Hartford, where I was, first of all, a man at a bridal shower, and second, in a house where no one was speaking any English. The two afternoons were neck and neck as far as that goes. But we took this professor out to dinner afterwards, and he was actually surprisingly good company. After supper, this professor who was from Poland suggested a toast, and he said, "Here's to the Russian Navy, bottoms up." I'm going to tell you about my landlord back when I was in grad school, a retired bank president named Henry Pierce. He was very wealthy, and he was one of the few men I've ever known who was less handy than I was. In fact, believe it or not, he hired me to be his handyman. I realized the church trustees are already getting a good laugh about that, but I knew more about practical things than he did. I lived in a section of his estate when I was in school and did various jobs on the grounds. I mowed lawns, trimmed hedges, took out the trash, shoveled snow, and so on. He called me Alan. I called him Mr. Pierce. He also had a wood lot, and he would drive out there with his old, oversized Jeep, and we would get firewood, and then he would come back, and he would split it, but I would cut it for him. We went to his wood lot one day, and I remember I was just about to cut down a dead tree. I'd actually run the saw for about a minute, and I looked up and saw that Mr. Pierce had wandered right about where I expected the tree to fall. So of course I stopped and had to move about 50 yards away. And I cut the tree down, the dead tree, cut it up into pieces, loaded up the Jeep, and in retrospect, overloaded the Jeep. We began driving back with Mr. Pierce at the wheel. At one light, I noticed that the brakes made an awful noise, and I could feel the vehicle pulling to one side. I wondered if I should say something. Advice to young people who are watching right now: always say something. The next light was red, and we drove right through it. Fortunately, there was no one coming the other way. "Mr. Pierce?" "Yes, Alan." I think you just ran a red light." "Yes, I know. The brakes don't seem to work." And he demonstrated that by pushing on the brake and nothing happening. And then he said words that sometimes come back to me in nightmares. He turned to me and said, "What do you think I should do now?" And I sat there thinking, uh-oh, something bad's going to happen to me. So I told him to keep pumping the brake, and we went through another light, which fortunately was green. I had, by this point, fortunately, with some difficulty, put the Jeep into neutral. And since we were going uphill now, the Jeep was starting to slow down. And I pulled the wheel over so the vehicle was on the shoulder, and then I yanked on the emergency brake, which of course I should have remembered earlier, and fortunately that worked. And the vehicle skidded to a halt. I almost wept with relief. Then Mr. Pierce said, "Alan, there's a gas station about a mile from here. Since we know the emergency brake works, why don't we drive there? I'll go slowly." It's the only time I raised my voice the whole day. "No!" I said. So I walked to the gas station. I arranged for the vehicle to be towed. And if my guardian angel is watching right now, I just want to say one word: thanks. I don't usually speak of people in the church whom you might have known, but now that Ruth has been gone, it's more than 25 years, I thought it might be all right to do so. Ruth was an eccentric. She'd call me up on the phone and say, "Alan, you know who this is?" Her voice was like that. She didn't want to identify herself on the phone because she thought my line might be tapped. Why anyone would want to do so, I don't know. I'd go and visit her in senior housing. She kept her Venetian blinds down all day, and when I was there, she'd be peering out suspiciously to see if we were being watched. I began visiting her regularly after her longtime companion died. She was illiterate, so I'd go to her apartment on the first of the month and fill out the rental check, which she would sign. She could sign her name. And then I would bring it to the manager of the senior complex, since she was too reclusive to deal with him. Because she did not have a driver's license, I'd also take her to the grocery store once or twice a month. Her neighbor in senior housing, who was a gruff and good-natured man, had offered to do so, but she refused. "Alan, he's a drinker. Alan, he drinks." I think she would have said that about a man who had 2 beers a week, but that was her attitude. So I'd take her shopping, and she'd buy nothing except all those things which our mother told us when we were 6 years old not to eat too much of. And by the way, this woman who never exercised, who did not eat right, and who had never once in her life been to a doctor, was never sick and lived well into her 80s, so go figure. Ruth disapproved of most people, but she liked me because I was a Baptist minister. She was herself a hard-shell Baptist of the most conservative sort. She listened on the radio every Saturday night to sermons from a church in New Jersey which called itself the Temple of the Burning Bush. And she described with approval the sermons she'd heard, which said that the time of tribulation was at hand for the unrighteous, that crowds of unbelievers were even now running down the throat of the beast whose breath would scorch them like the blast of a furnace, that the worshippers of the beast would be struck down and their blood would rise up from the winepress of wrath up to the horse's bridle. It was all kind of along those lines. She apparently didn't notice that my own preaching style is kind of different. I hope this isn't a commentary on how much people listen to sermons. I also used to take her to the bank. Ruth never bathed and only wore one outfit that other people in church used to offer to buy clothes for her. She refused. We were kind of a spectacle. Whenever we entered the bank, I could see the tellers, giggling like that. One day, the new manager wouldn't let her access her account without an ID. Of course, she had none. The old manager had thought, in my opinion rightly, that someone as unmistakable as Ruth didn't need an ID. But the new man said that was the policy, so I solved that problem. I did the talking since Ruth was hard of hearing. And I remember at the time the manager saying to me with a testy voice, "Listen, you're going to have to tell your mother, this and that." It was the only time in the conversation that I got just a little testy myself. She's not my mother. I later described that scene to my own mother, who of course was still alive in those days, and she got a good laugh out of that part. Years ago, I remember I went to the hospital to visit someone who I knew was a difficult personality. He did not attend church, but I knew his son, who was quite a nice guy. Based on what I knew about the dad, I figured the son must have taken after the mother, who had died many years before and whom I hadn't known. So when the son asked me to visit his dad, of course I went. So I knocked at his room in the hospital, was told to come in. When I did, I saw he was sitting in a chair entirely naked. I began to leave, saying that I would come back later, and he insisted cheerfully that I remain. We talked briefly about his medical condition, which was dire. I said a prayer and left, and I bumped into his daughter-in-law, whom I knew slightly. The daughter-in-law said that she'd been about to enter and then saw that he was naked, wasn't sure what to do. So I went back in, explained to him that his daughter-in-law was outside and that she wouldn't be comfortable coming in until he was dressed, and I told him I would call her once he'd put on a robe. For some reason, this set him off. He said loudly he didn't give a hoot, not actually the word he used, what she was comfortable with, that he needed her to run some errands for her right now, and you tell her to come in here. And he added a few other ripe curses, the kind that used to get you detention back when I was in school, and prodded my chest with his stubby finger. Now here's where I made a mistake. What I should have done at that point was tell him I wasn't going to deal with him until he could act like a gentleman, and walked out and recommended to his daughter-in-law that she do the same. But I was a very young pastor at the time. I figured he was old and sick. I needed to make allowances. So I went back out into the hallway and explained to the daughter-in-law what he said. His voice had carried enough that she'd heard it anyway. She, of course, had known him for a long time and said, "Well, I'm glad to see he's feeling like his old self again." I belong to a group which is growing fresh produce for local food pantries. We have some plants in the ground at the Samuel Smith farmstead here in East Lyme. One of the people on the committee was having a problem with slugs and wondered what to do. Back in my own farm days, a long time ago, we would have sprayed for something like that, but our group is going organic. So I suggested putting a little beer in a bowl at ground level. The slugs are attracted to it and drowned. One time my brother did that in his garden, and it worked so well that once the beer evaporated, and the next morning we found several slugs walking around on the bottom of the empty bowl, saying, I guess in effect, "Hey, where's the party?" So Violetta says to me one day, "I'm going to Walmart. Can I pick you up anything?" "Yeah, could you get me a six-pack?" "What? A six-pack of beer? I know what a six-pack is." "Well, better get cans. I'm not sure we have a bottle opener." "We've been married 35 years and you're going to take up drinking beer?" "It's not for me." "Well, who's it for?" "It's for slugs." "Well, who's taking a slug?" "Well, gardening." "What are you talking about?" Well, we finally got this straightened out, and she got the beer, and I want you to know that at the Samuel Smith farmstead, I've opened up a tab for the slugs. When the Chinese cook, what they do is they leave a creature's head on. And there are advantages to this. Violetta says that when you buy fish, looking at the eyes is one way of telling how fresh it is. No doubt she's right, but it's strange to sit down for your meal and see it looking up at you on the plate. But it's also like that when you buy a duck in the Chinese grocery. I mean, they've removed the feathers, but the rest of the bird is there. Back when we first married, we were living in Danbury, Connecticut, and Violetta decided to make Peking duck. She wanted it to be a surprise, and of course I do like it. You prepare the duck by marinating it and then hanging it by its neck for several hours in the refrigerator. I was commuting in those days to New Haven. I came back a little earlier than I'd expected. Violetta was out. I went over and I opened up the refrigerator and closed it because there it was hanging like that. I closed the door and then opened it up real cautiously and looked again. Well, I will say, it was good. I'll tell you a story from long ago. We knew a kid who I'll refer to as Bill, who was about 16. Long hair was controversial in those days. He grew his hair long. His father told him to cut it. He wouldn't. His dad threw him out of the house and told him not to return until it was cut. And both father and son were too stubborn to budge on this. So Bill slept outside or at various friends' homes. And he would drop by our house now and then for a meal. My dad, always the most kind-hearted of men, was always very hospitable. In fact, I remember when winter came on, he gave him a coat. My mother, who after all was doing all the cooking, was a little more cold-eyed about him. One time when the weather had gotten bad, my father allowed him to sleep downstairs here in the church basement. A day or two later, he came to our door in a panic, and he said to my dad, Rev, that's what he called my dad. "Rev, I got to talk to you." Now, there was another person who happened to be there already who had a sad problem, and my father told Bill he just couldn't talk to him now and that he'd have to leave. But Bill was hysterical, and he kept saying, "The police are raiding the church. The police are raiding the church." "Bill, what are you talking about?" He said he was going over to the church, and it was surrounded by police cars. And my dad said that he had a funeral later that day for a state trooper, and that was just the honor guard setting up. So the church was not being raided. Why would it be? Bill was relieved. Color returned to his cheeks. It turned out he'd been hiding his marijuana in the church. Now, at that time, Bill's use of the sanctuary as well as a sanctuary also cost us the services of our custodian. A day or two after this, she showed up at the door. She was quite upset, and she said to my father, "There's a dead man at the church." She'd gone to the church to clean up and had almost tripped over Bill, who was a sound sleeper. And my father, unfortunately, had forgotten to tip her off. And she quit on the spot, and neither my dad then or myself now blame her. In later years, Bill joined the Army. Boot camp, which is such an ordeal for everyone else, was a breeze for Bill, who at this point had been used to roughing it. After a hitch in the service, he converted to some particularly strict form of Pentecostalism, and he came by the house, for the first time in years. And thinking my dad was not properly strict in his faith and fearing hellfire, he told my dad that he had to convert to a truer form of Christianity, adding, "Rev, you're too good a man to burn." And my mother grumbled after he left, "Well, he didn't think I was too good to burn." Last week, I began telling you about a teenager named Bill. I told you how he scraped along after his father had kicked him out of their house for having long hair. He was sleeping in various spots, often on the floors of sympathetic friends. He was beginning to work as soon as he could, which meant letters, including paychecks, began coming by mail. My father let him use our address for that, and Bill would drop by now and then and pick up his mail. Eventually, Bill had the wherewithal to buy a used car. It was the early 1970s at that point. There was a shortage of gasoline. Bill filled lots of old empty milk containers with gasoline, and he had them lined up across his back seat. Once, when he was driving that way, he was smoking a cigarette. And I realize a lot of you are going to say, he was driving a car with all sorts of improperly stored gasoline and he lit up a cigarette. And all I can say is, yes. And he then attempted to toss the cigarette butt out the open car window, but the wind blowing in the window blew it into the back seat and set the upholstery to smoldering. Bill, in some alarm, decided he better pull over, so he drove into the gas station here at Flanders Four Corners. And again, I realize a lot of you are going to stop and say, with a car filled with gasoline which was improperly stored and with the fire starting, you mean he pulled into a gas station? And again, all I can say is yes. He drove in there with smoke pouring out of his open window, and then he parked next to the pumps. The station manager, also a teenager, came out with a fire extinguisher, and Bill yelled out, "Careful, the back seat is full of gasoline." The man instantly ran and called the fire department, who at considerable risk, I mean, this is the part of the story which is not funny, at considerable risk did put the fire out safely. The next day, our local paper, The Day, had a headline in those bold letters that are usually reserved for the outbreak of war or the assassination of a president. It said, "Blast averted on Route 161. The reporter said that the driver was criminally negligent, had endangered the firemen and all nearby traffic. The paper dispensed with all those usual niceties like allegedly or police claimed or anything like that. Bill was named, and his address was given out. Our address. Some clergymen, as you know, wear a clerical collar around their neck. Roman Catholic priests do. I'm not sure if this is still the case, but years ago they were supposed to wear them at all times. I remember our old friend Father Flint, who used to be the priest at St. Paul's in Waterford, told us, this was decades ago, that he went on a vacation to Brazil, and he was glad he could finally get away with not wearing his collar, and he got off the plane in Rio and was walking through the airport wearing a Hawaiian shirt, and suddenly he heard, "Yoo-hoo, Father Flint," and he ran into a member of his own parish who happened to be in the same airport. Episcopalians and Lutherans wear them too. They don't seem to wear them at all times. I'm not sure quite what the rules are for them. I don't have to wear one, and for the most part I'm glad, but there's one single exception to that. As you know, I live in a commercial district with various businesses around me. Once, many years ago, we were eating supper. It was summer. I was wearing shorts. I think Peter at the time was in a high chair. A man whom I didn't know came to the door. He hesitated a little. He was having trouble speaking. He said, I've never done anything like this before. Well, I have conversations like this now and then, so I said, well, why don't we go into the parlor and we can talk about it? And we did, and he said, we're getting a divorce. And I'm used to conversations beginning like that too, so I expressed my sympathy. I asked him to describe what was going on. He described their unhappiness at some length. I said maybe each one could take a turn talking to me. Perhaps we could figure out a way of reconciling. I had some experience with this kind of thing. He said he didn't think it was worth trying. The marriage was too far gone. I said, well, sometimes you at least need to give it a try. No harm giving me a chance to see what I can do. He replied that though he appreciated that, they were both sure such an effort would be useless. Well, I then said if they really both were finally agreed on a divorce, then he really should be talking, not to me, but to a lawyer. There was a long pause. The man said, aren't you a lawyer? I said, no, I'm Reverend Scott. It turned out he'd been going to an attorney's office, which was at that time located next door to us. He apologized, he hustled out the door, and I never saw him again. And this never would have happened if I'd been wearing a clerical collar. After his wife left him, a middle-aged man used to call me regularly. And over the years, the two of them had had a stormy relationship. When the wife came to church, which she did once in a great while, when she came to church, I'd always utter a little curse inside, because when things were okay, I wouldn't see her. If I saw her, it meant there was trouble. They were unhappy together, they were unhappy apart. Unfortunately, they didn't seem to have anybody in the world except each other. Finally, after threatening to do so many times and after a particularly bad altercation, the wife walked out and was now living in housing provided by the Women's Center. The husband would call me. He had no other friends, and he was glad to have somebody to talk to. The wife I'm going to call him Frank, the wife had called Frank and told him that she was in a secret location provided by the Women's Center, I think pretty much in a spirit of nya, nya, nya. And he had responded by calling the Women's Center and ranting and demanding to know where she was. They had called the police, who came by his house and told him to knock it off or else. He'd been distraught before, but now he was really upset. And after this, for a week, he'd be calling me every night. We'd talk a while. I'd try to say something upbeat. And he was grateful. Night after night, he'd end our conversation with, I'll never forget this, bud. One night, when we were talking, he said he couldn't understand how his wife had found out about the Women's Center. I know her. This isn't the kind of thing she would know about. She wouldn't have even known where something like that was. If I ever find the guy who sent her there, I'll wring his neck. And I got after him for talking like this, reminding him he'd been pretty close to trouble with the law. He didn't want to get any closer, and he calmed down and he agreed I was right. Then I steered the conversation back to how he might adapt to his, new way of life, and how it was going to be different, but how it might end up being a blessing in disguise. And he agreed and said he felt better talking to me. And actually, at this point in the conversation, I was feeling better too, since I, of course, was the one who had driven his wife to the Women's Center. When I was in seminary, there was a student there along with me named Scott Allen. Even though his last name was spelled A-L-L-E-N, his name and mine were often confused, Allen Scott, Scott Allen. And Scott was one of those guys who was in frequent minor trouble. Years ago, I think I already mentioned to you in a sermon that he had borrowed a beer tap from the dining hall for a party he put on, and he didn't return it. And one day I was peacefully eating lunch in the cafeteria with a book in my hand, and a member of the cafeteria staff came out and started screaming at me, saying he'd better have that beer tap by tonight, or I'd find the bill on my bursar's bill. And I sat there open-mouthed while he stomped off. And I'm told that when he got to the kitchen, his partner was howling with laughter because he had yelled at the wrong guy. And I mentioned in that earlier sermon that that actually had worked out just fine for me, because on those rare occasions when we were served something particularly good, like fried shrimp or something like that, this guy in the cafeteria, when I came through, would give me twice as much as he gave to everyone else. Scott was a cheerful, likable, party-going type, and I was more the shy, studious type. Once he got a note for an overdue library book that was actually, supposed to go to me. And several times during my years in seminary, I'd received warning slips about courses or threats of academic probation. The first one I got rattled me a little, but soon I caught on, and I would just routinely hand these things over to Scott. We both graduated. We both entered the ministry. We lost touch a long time ago. Fast forward 30 years. I went to visit my dad, who you remember is named Reverend Allen Scott, and his first name is actually spelled A-L-L-E-N. At that time, I was in my 50s, and my dad was in his 80s. He'd received a bill he wanted to talk to me about. It was from a California police department, which said that because his teenage son was a minor, he was liable for all his parking tickets that his son had rung up there, together with the penalties. And the bill was for over $2,000. My father was baffled and didn't know what to do. He had no children or grandchildren, minor or otherwise, who lived or went anywhere near California. So, using the local police department to make sure that this was not a scam, I called the police department in question. And the person at the police department in California asked me for the last 4 digits of my father's Social Security number, which I gave to him. And the police officer said, "Oh, it's a different guy. Yeah, the name's different too. This fine is for the son of someone named Reverend Scott Allen." You may remember about a month or so back in one of these sound tests, I mentioned a difficult old-timer who I visited once at the hospital. And you may recall that I described the tirade I was subjected to when I was on that visit, and I described it to his daughter-in-law, who was out waiting in the hallway. And she said, "Well, I'm glad to see he's feeling like his old self again." My father, who could find the best and even the most unlikely of people, once admitted to a different relative of this man, this man's sister-in-law, that he was half angel and half devil. She replied that she had never seen the angel part. Around the same time, I met a client at the soup kitchen in New London, whom I'll refer to as Sam, who described himself as a friend, which I think in this context means drinking buddy of this old pain in the neck. Normally, anybody who introduced himself to me in this way was someone I would have kept at arm's length. But as it turned out, Sam was a hard man to dislike. He was a cheerful, outgoing old guy who spoke with a very, very thick Polish accent. Street people lie routinely. I mean, when a panhandler tells you about the plight of their family, you generally can figure the story is as phony as a $3 bill. I mean, there's a reason why the words mendicant and mendacious are related. Our clients, were always inventing for themselves new and more interesting versions of their lives. In the 70s and 80s, when you met these people, they often said they were Vietnam veterans, even though they usually weren't. I mean, partly this was because it was a way of getting more money from passersby, but I think also it was because they felt that they, like Vietnam vets, were somehow victims of America, so that their story, though inaccurate, was not entirely false. In the 1990s, they were often saying that they were victims of AIDS, even when they weren't. Again, one reason they did so, this was a way of getting money from people, a little more money at the time, because there was sympathetic money available. But this was also because, in their opinion, I think, like AIDS victims, they were pariahs who were misunderstood and yet somehow tragic. So when people like this tell me something, I listen, I nod, and I pay no attention. One night, Sam came through the line, and he told me that he had been in a Nazi concentration camp during the Second World War. He said, I'm not Jewish, I'm Polish, but when I was a teenager, they kidnapped me and took me to work in one of their camps. And I said, wow, that must have been some experience, Sam. Would you like some more tomato sauce with that? Like a lot of old people, he tended to wear coats and long sleeves longer than the rest of us. But about a month or so later, one very hot summer night at the soup kitchen, he came in for the first time with his sleeves rolled up. There on his arm was branded the number that he had been given in the concentration camp. You see, Sam, in a way, had deceived me for the very first time, since it turned out that, for once, he'd been telling me the truth. Once I was visiting a man whom I'll refer to as Doug. He was confined to a group home after he had chased a jogger around with a knife during a mental health breakdown. I knew Doug. He had used to work for us on the farm. I don't think he would have hurt anyone, but it was a case where obviously the law had to intervene. Doug had been on disability for a long time with mental illness, and as I say, he used to work with us. With Doug, work was a misleading word. He would watch us and so get a change of pace from living, as he did at the time, at his sister's house. Once we were in the fields longer than he cared to wait, and he decided he would hitchhike home. A couple gave him a ride, and he told them that if they came back, we would give them free strawberries in return, which we did. All this by way of saying that having him as an employee was not all gravy. After his arrest, the state of Connecticut sent him to a very well-run group home. I would visit him there. We'd watch a little television together or wait for the mail to come. My mother would write him about once a month or so. Or, he would kid with the aides there. Once when I was there, a very likable handyman came to the room to do some work and asked Doug where he could plug in his drill. Doug extended his backside and said, "How about there?" And the handyman replied, "Doug, the drill runs on electricity, not gas." How Doug laughed at that, which was nice to see. Occasionally, there was also a case manager, blessings on her too, would take Doug to a thrift shop where he would be pleased to get some small bargain. And he bought a secondhand three-piece suit, and he wore it constantly around the group home, making him look like sort of a mafia lawyer. One winter day, we sat outside in the sun together, and he asked how my Uncle Bruce was doing. Of course, Uncle Bruce was someone he had worked with on the farm. I replied that he had retired. Doug was indignant. "He's too young to be retired." And I said, "Well, he's 66. I guess at that age he has the right to retire." And Doug stretched out his hands and said, "As long as there's strength in these arms and legs, I'll never retire." I liked the way he used the English language. His brother Fred once had given him a new coat, and he said, "Fred has a heart as big as gold." He told me that his sister Minnie, though, had a problem. She smokes like a fish. Doug himself had given up smoking at the request of a girlfriend he had made at the institution. Though a bit limited, she actually had quite a good influence on him and had stopped him from cadging money from foolishly indulgent people like myself. And once I was visiting her at a nursing home one time when she was recovering from a broken hip, and I asked how she was doing. And she said she hoped to return soon to the group home. "As long as I'm where Doug is, I'm happy." So I went back to tell Doug how his girlfriend was doing. And after that, we talked a little bit about our old days on the farm together. I mentioned a mutual acquaintance we both had, actually Cecil Banning, whom some of you will know, who had just turned 95. And Doug looked thoughtful for a moment and said, "I wouldn't want to live that long. I might end up in some kind of home." Years ago, many years ago, I was doing a funeral for a certain individual and was trying to find out about his life as I prepared the eulogy. His 3 brothers-in-law were telling me about various scrapes they'd all gotten in together over the years. Now, my job in a eulogy is to say something positive about the deceased, and most of what they told me about this old friend of theirs sounded like a case put together by the prosecutor's office. The 4 of them had been in endless trouble when they were young and had behaved perhaps only marginally better since then. And I don't remember how I limped along with this funeral, since most of what they told me was unusable. Among the offenses they had done when they were juvenile delinquents, they had since become, what can I say, senile delinquents. They told me about a night they'd raised Cain as teenagers back in the 1950s. They had been randomly knocking over mailboxes and throwing rocks through windows. One of the places they broke windows turned out to be the local synagogue. Now, reports of the Holocaust were then fresh in everyone's mind. The case was rightly, carefully investigated. The full weight of the law was rightly brought to bear, and they were caught and rightly punished. In fact, they said they were surprised by just how much hot water they ended up in. But looking back on this youthful episode, one of these paunchy, graying in-laws remarked to me earnestly, "You have to understand, we didn't even know what a synagogue was." And I will say, looking at these three chuckleheads, this did have the ring of truth. Here's a story about friendship. When we were first married, we lived in New Fairfield, which is a suburb of Danbury. An IBM exec had moved with his job just for the summer to another place, doing another job in Canada. And he wanted someone to live in his house and do a few small chores to keep the place going while he was gone. The rent was nominal. It was a good temporary arrangement for us, since Violetta was playing the organ in the Roman Catholic Church in that town. Meanwhile, I was commuting every day to New Haven to finish up my degree. Violetta had a friend in conservatory named Lionel, who was later a friend of mine as well. He came down to see us, a black man, a very talented musician. A friend had put a rowboat at our disposal, and we went down to her home on Candlewood Lake, which is a resort spot there. I'd often rowed Violetta around the lake. It had been a good way of spending a summer afternoon. Lionel was a big man whose weight fluctuated a lot. He'd been quite lean when we'd all been living together in New Haven. He's actually very trim now, but in those days he'd gained a lot of weight. I bet at the time he weighed about 300 pounds. And so when he hopped into one end of the boat, I almost shot out of the other like a catapult. As it was, my part of the boat was kind of up out of the water. And but still, I gamely started rowing, and Lionel enjoyed the ride. His hand was trailing along in the water as he looked at the mansions which were built onto the lake. Meanwhile, it was a summer day. Sweat was pouring down my face and into my eyes. It kind of felt like the galley scene in the movie Ben-Hur. Meanwhile, Lionel's end of the boat was so low in the water that I was afraid we might sink. We finally did get back to the dock. Lionel said he had a great time. I was secretly relieved that we hadn't accidentally ended up sinking our friend's rowboat. But as it turned out, Lionel more than paid me back. A year or two later, after that, in October of 1987, I was ordained at a service here in Flanders, together with my younger brother Jonathan, who's now the hospital chaplain at the Day Kimball Hospital. One of Jonathan's friends in seminary was a black man who was not only a pastor but also a talented singer, and we had him scheduled to sing a solo that day. Due to some kind of mix-up, he did not appear. Lionel, as it turned out, had also come to see my ordination. He was sitting out in the audience. I asked if he would come up to the piano and play anything just to fill up that slot in the program. This was only about 5 or 10 minutes before we began. He graciously agreed to do so. So at that spot in the program, Lionel looked around to make sure my brother's friend had not arrived late, and when no one stood up, he walked over to the piano here, and without any sheet music or any rehearsal, he played and sang from memory the song Ordinary People. Believe me, it was easily the best thing about the service, and a good choice for the ordination. So, a little story about friendship. Over the years, I've taken the youth group to various places. I remember, this would be about 15 years ago, I took 3 middle school age girls to see Gillette's Castle. Our middle school age, our youth group goes from middle school, starting around 5th grade, through high school. This was a trip that had 3 5th graders, so they were kids on the younger side. We drove out on a Sunday afternoon, and I can remember how the conversation that day went. I had a compact disc of classical music playing, and the girls protested and asked if they could listen to a certain popular radio station instead. Now, I probably should have let them. I mean, they correctly said that the vote was 3-1, but after a busy morning, I, who was doing the driving and making all the arrangements, curtly refused. I think I can remember how the conversation went from there. Nobody listens to music like that. Well, as a matter of fact, I'm listening to it. Well, no one under the age of 100 listens to it. Excuse me, I'm not 100. Well, have you looked in the mirror lately? And then a chorus of girlish laughter. It's actually a pretty long drive to Gillette's Castle from East Lyme, and the whole day was like that. Let me describe another trip. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was driving members of the youth group to the Peabody Museum in New Haven. We went there on a hot Sunday afternoon with stop-and-go traffic on I-95. About halfway there, one of the girls said she was going to be carsick. I was, as you might imagine, nervous, but decided to keep driving and hope for the best. The only boy who came along with us that day said that his sister had gotten carsick recently, and he began giving us a detailed description of what it looked like and smelled like, until I told him sharply to pipe down. As it turned out, the girl who felt ill went to sleep in the car, and she woke up fine. We ended up having a good time. On the drive back home, the same girl had one of those fits where she could not stop giggling. Everything was funny. It was cute at first, then slightly annoying later, and finally, after a while, I thought I was going to end up in a straitjacket hearing all this giggling in the back seat. But I whispered to the student who was sitting up in the front seat next to me, Holly, as it turned out, "Well, at least this is better than being carsick." And she replied, "You're telling me. On the ride down, I was the one sitting next to her." I remember years ago I did a funeral for an immigrant family who spoke limited English. About a week or so after the funeral, I called and dropped by to see how they were doing. As it turned out, I had come from a big meal at home, but due to the language difficulty, the couple thought that I was coming to eat with them. And the wife had made a huge supper, and she said she and her husband had no appetite, but she was happy to be back cooking again and said it made her feel a little better. And then the two of them sat there and watched me eat every bite. After doing our best to talk together for a while, we each understood about half of what the other was saying. The wife brought out a glass of cold liquid and put it in my hand. She said, "Aloe." I was about to say hello back, and then I noticed the letters ALOE on the bottle. I said, "Aloe?" She said, "Aloe. It rubs on skin." I looked at her for a moment. Did she mean that I was supposed to rub this on my skin? Then I noticed the husband was drinking his glass, so I cautiously sipped mine. She said, "Is good for stomach." At that point, I didn't have much of an appetite for anything, but I finished the glass. The taste was unfamiliar. And after I finished, I had the panicky feeling that whatever this liquid was, maybe it was not meant to be ingested. I mean, I'd read stories about immigrants who had tried to use lemon-scented cleaning solutions to be a substitute for lemons, and I wondered if I was drinking some kind of skin cream. I was also nervous about her claim that this was good for the stomach. What exactly was it going to do to my stomach? My fears were groundless. It turns out that this is there is an imported beverage which does have aloe as an agreement. So I had indigestion that night, but it was from overeating and not from the aloe. So if you see this aloe beverage in the grocery store, don't be afraid to give it a try. Over the years, of course, I've performed a lot of weddings. I've twice been in ceremonies where a member of the bridal party fainted. Twice I've seen a dog serve as best man. Once it worked out great, the other time not so much. I had a service once where the groom was 2 hours late. He'd gone sailing on his wedding day and gotten caught in a calm. I saw the look on the bride's face when I explained all this to her, and I hoped that he didn't get caught in a storm when the ceremony was over. Once I did a wedding at Pequot Chapel, and when I said, "You may kiss the bride," to my surprise, a friend of the groom drove up the steps and went down the first few pews of the church, revving up his Harley. The woman who ran the Pequot Chapel was furious. When I saw that the motorcycle had not left any mark, I didn't give the matter any more thought, though I will admit that I don't think too many people that day were listening to my benediction. A very common problem over the years happens because by state law, wedding licenses are only good in the town that they're written in. In other words, you can't get a wedding license in Niantic and then use it in the town of Waterford. I always go over this with couples when I'm talking to them, but there's several times when this has come up and been an issue. Once, for example, I was performing a wedding at the Officers Club at the Navy base in Groton. And somebody, I forget who it was now, tipped me off that the Navy base is so large in Groton that it extends over into the town of Ledyard. And it turns out that's where the Officers Club is located, which is where we were having the wedding ceremony. So I had to actually direct them to the town of Ledyard for their license. Another time, a couple who lived on the Waterford side of the Waterford-New London boundary, for some reason had gotten their wedding license in New London. We'd been expecting to do the lawn there outside on a summer day on the lawn of the bride and groom, the home that they were renting there. I saw that the next door neighbor in New London was tending his lawn, and I went over to him and I explained the whole thing about the bind we were in and about towns and licenses, and he looked at me after I got through explaining the whole thing and said, "Huh?" But once I finally got the point across, he was more than gracious, and we just moved over to the next lawn. Another time, a military couple in Groton was getting married at the Grassy Hill Church in Lyme. I saw at the Grassy Hill Church that they had gotten a Groton license, and I said to the couple, "Listen, I'll drive you to the reception," which was taking place at the old Constantine's in Niantic. So I drove the two of them out on I-95 across the Gold Star Bridge, and I pointed to the sign on the bridge that says, "Entering Town of Groton," and asked if they still wanted to get married, and they said yes. And after that, I dropped them off at the reception, which means from a legal point of view, that couple actually was married on I-95 on the Gold Star Bridge. Another problem with weddings is that sometimes they change their plans and they forget to tell me. This is why, by the way, halls and resorts always want a deposit. I mean, couples will remember to call if they're getting their money back. As a young pastor one time, I was scheduled to do a wedding at the Grassy Hill Church. Now I always take the precaution of checking with the couple, the week leading up to the wedding, make sure everything is still on. But this was back when I first started, and I'd gotten stood up a few times over the years, and it was a pretty late October afternoon. The leaves were turning color, and I was sitting on the steps there at the Grassy Hill Church, which is a pretty sight anyway. I had a book in my hand. The sun was just beginning to set. The time for the wedding came and went. No one had shown up. I figured they'd probably made other plans and forgotten to tell me. It was pretty enough there that I decided just to stay there a little while longer and continue reading. Just when I was thinking of going home, a limo pulled up, and the bride and groom stepped out. He was wearing a tuxedo. She was wearing a gown, and there were no guests. It turned out they'd been drawing up a wedding list, and it had so quickly gotten out of hand with a sort of a, if you invite X, you have to invite Y, and if you invite Y, you have to invite Z, that they finally decided they were just going to do the wedding by themselves. They were late because the limo driver had gotten lost. This was before GPS. So I did the ceremony, and after that, the uniformed limo driver opened up a bottle of champagne. The two of them offered to let the driver and me join them. We declined. So the two of them clinked glasses and drank a toast, and they drove off into what really was a glorious sunset. Now, I've seen live bands and horses and buggies and antique cars and done weddings on beaches and been in every hall and resort in this area and several out of state. But for me, that was, I think, the single most memorable wedding ceremony I ever did. I have visited people in the local prisons in Nyack and Montville, and also one in Middletown. One of the first things I've learned doing this is to wear a pair of pants that fit snugly so I don't need a belt. Otherwise, my belt buckle sets off the metal detector. Car keys, phones, and wallets are not allowed in the cell block because you're not allowed to let the inmates make a call or give them money, or for that matter, to give them a skeleton key. So the guard at the desk offers the use of a locker to put these things in. But the locker has no padlock, and there's always some sinister types in the waiting room. So what I do instead is to lock my wallet and phone in my glove compartment and then hide the keys inside my car and leave my car unlocked. I figured anyone would have to be a pretty cool hand to be trying to hotwire a car in a prison parking lot. Not just anybody can make a visit. The prisoner is allowed a very short list of family and friends who can see them, and it's a very short number of names that are allowed, something like 3 names. Prisoners are additionally allowed to be visited by their clergy if they list in advance the clergyman's name. And then background checks are run on all these names, which takes a little time, so you can't see them right away. When you do go, you get buzzed into a room, and a man sees you on a camera and waits for a moment to make sure the door behind you is latched, and then buzzes you into the cell block. And I end up either sitting across a table from an inmate, or if the security is a little tighter, seeing them from behind a glass screen and then talking to them on a phone. Normally, when I do a visit with someone, I take the hand of the person before I leave and I say a prayer, but you're not allowed to make any physical contact with the inmate. The guards are, afraid you might try to slip them something. And you're watched discreetly during the whole visit. I will say I've always been treated very politely when I've been there. In theory, all this sounds easy. Inmates will know that I'm going in, and they will include my name on the paperwork, and then I'll drop by and see them during the visiting hours. In fact, something always seems to go wrong, and several times I've gone out to prisons and been told that my name is not on a list that I expected it to be on. Usually it just means the paperwork hasn't caught up yet, and sometimes it doesn't catch up until after the prisoner is released. I remember once I was visiting somebody at Corrigan, that's the one up in Montville, and I showed the guard my driver's license. He checked the inmate's paperwork. He said my name was not on the list and I couldn't be admitted, which had happened to me before. Before I left, he asked if I was an attorney because I was wearing a jacket and tie, and I told him that, no, in fact, I was a pastor. And for the first time in the conversation, he really looked up and said, "Reverend Scott, you did my wedding 20 years ago." And he told me who I was. I have to admit I didn't recognize the name, and then he buzzed me in. I went through the locked door where I can't leave until he buzzes me back out, and I remember thinking at the time, I hope it's been a happy marriage. The traditional image of death is that he's the Grim Reaper. He's hooded and carries a scythe. This is to take a harvest of death. Looks creepy. But death, in fact, has many phases. I would agree sometimes death is very frightening. I remember once, I was going to say 20 years ago, I think it's more like 25, I went out to an unpainted shack after a certain poor and very difficult individual had died. I waded out through the uncut grass, which was up to my waist, and was admitted to the house by his common-law wife. The funeral director was already there, as was a son by a prior marriage. The family had taken the few chairs in the house. They were carrying on a noisy conversation. We were waiting for them to finish. The funeral director stood. I sat on the floor. The various survivors agreed that the deceased had it coming. And anger and many obscenities were directed at various relatives who were not there. They said that they would settle scores and cut them out of the estate, and certainly looking around at the place, it must have been pitifully small in any case. Finally, the funeral director interrupted and shouted them down. He said that unless they showed some respect for the dead and also for Reverend Scott and him, that unless they piped down, he was leaving. And at that, the family became quiet and sullen. And the director and I quickly planned the service, and we left. And when we left, we heard them taking up where they'd left off. That's one face of death. And though this was a long time ago, that scene stayed with me, and it, well, I think, unsettled me more than any horror movie I ever saw. But sometimes in death we see sadness or even pathos, but not fear. I remember about the same era, right around the same time, I went out to see an elderly woman whom I'd been visiting for some time. I was used to being harmlessly barked at by her lapdog from the moment I stepped out of the car to the moment I left. But now when I went up to the door, there was silence, and I knocked. The woman hobbled over to open it with her walker, and I said, "Where's Buck?" She replied, "I figured you'd notice he was gone. He'd been real sick, and I had the vet come to the house a few times. And the last time, the vet told me that she was going to have to put him down." Though she was outwardly calm, I saw how fragile she was. It's impossible to predict how grief will affect us. A couple of years earlier, I had buried this woman's son, and she had managed to be composed, but now she was on the verge of tears. She said, "The vet asked me if I wanted to leave the room, and I thought maybe it was better if I did." A couple of minutes later, the vet came back out and said just one word to me, "Done." I went in and stroked her fur, and I said, "I love you, Buck." I remember the first death I described to you with a shudder. Call it the reality of hell. And though it was about a dog, the other death strikes me as sad but not frightening. Love makes a difference. Tears are not always a bad thing. Despite knowing that he was about to raise his friend Lazarus from the dead, Jesus wept at his grave. It breaks our heart not just to experience grief, but to see it in others. But the book of Revelation reminds us that the day will come when God will wipe away every tear from our eyes and death will be no more. I'll conclude with these words of Jesus from John 16:33. "In this world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." Once I was working at the homeless shelter in New London. Violetta had made a chicken casserole for the clients there. They were coming through the line, and a homeless woman pointed to the casserole, and in Spanish obviously was asking me what it was. Now, I don't know Spanish, but I studied Latin in high school and college. Spanish is a Romance language based on Latin. So what I tried was I pulled out the Latin word for chicken, which is pullus, from which we get our word pullet, meaning a young chicken, pointed to it, and I will say that was an absolute failure. She looked quite blankly at me. The Spanish word is fairly close, pollo, but this was not horseshoes or hand grenades, so being close was not helpful. So at this time, I pointed to the chicken and said what I should have said the first time, "Buck, buck, 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 buck." And when I said that, she nodded, and I gave her some. I think I could have answered for either beef or pork. I will say that night I was glad we were not serving tuna fish. One day years ago, I got a call from the hospital chaplain at L&M. He'd gone to see a man who was dying and asked if he wanted to see a pastor. The patient said he didn't want any clergy, that he was an atheist, and then he added that he wanted to be baptized, and he asked for me by name. The chaplain thought this was odd. I mean, why wouldn't an atheist want to be baptized? But he passed the message along. The name at first rang no bell, but as it turned out, when I was a chaplain with Hospice of Southeastern Connecticut in the 1990s, I had visited this man's wife when she was dying from cancer. The wife's brother, a shifty and sinister man, often in the house, would always pull me aside when I was there and make a point of telling me a very dirty story, not to be funny, but to see if he could shock me. So I said to the chaplain, "Oh yeah, I remember that family." As it turned out, both husband and wife were children of Italian immigrants. Most Italian immigrants to New London were Roman Catholic and attended St. Joseph's, where masses were conducted in Italian until fairly recently. But this family was from a group with communist, anarchist sympathies who were not on speaking terms with the larger group of immigrants for political reasons. They had declared themselves to be atheists, but as the man told me, what this really meant was that they were not Roman Catholic. Apparently, the priesthood in Italy in the 1930s, which is when he had immigrated here with his family, in the 1930s, the priesthood was politically very reactionary, often strong supporters of Mussolini. This man's family and later this man himself had been very involved in trade unions and left-wing causes. Weddings and funerals in the family were always pointedly done not in the Roman Catholic Church. The dying man did not disbelieve in God. I don't think that idea actually had ever occurred to him. But he had a low opinion of the clergy and of organized religion. We talked it over, and I pointed out that Jesus had never gotten along with the clergy either. I baptized him. A month later, I did his funeral. It was a graveside service in a very Italian and no doubt very Roman Catholic section of St. Mary's Cemetery in New London. A proud and determined nonconformist, laid to rest now among old political enemies. May peace be upon his soul. Martin Amis wrote a novel called Time's Arrow, which follows a person's life with his last years and then going backwards to his childhood, so it's seen back to front. I remember when I was pretty new as a pastor, a patient whom I'd been visiting at the hospital had gone home where he had suddenly been stricken. He had died by the time I got to the emergency room. In the time I'd been visiting with him, which had been some time, I'd become close to the family, wonderful people, and his wife was by his bedside weeping in the ER. I wept too. I tried to close his eyes, which were open, but as I say, I was new to the job, and I didn't have quite the knack of doing so, and his eyes kept reopening. Most of my experiences with nurses over the years have been very good, but that day the nurse told me to say a prayer with the family and leave since they wanted that space in the ER. And under the circumstances, I don't think we should have been hurried in that way, but I did what I was told. I said a prayer. We said goodbye to each other. Since I was in the hospital anyway, I decided I'd stop by the front desk to see if anybody else I knew was in there. And it turned out that there was a person associated with the church here who was in maternity. So I went to see her, and she had just delivered a son. It was a beautiful child, flailing arms, wide, unfocused eyes. It was a room full of smiles and slapbacks. So it was like the novel I mentioned at the beginning. There was life, back to front, and all in the same afternoon. Occasionally I'll get a phone call from one of the undertakers who is with a family who has no pastor, but wants one for a funeral. Decades ago, I did a service like that for a man who certainly not had an easy life. He'd been divorced, he'd been laid off. This was during one of those economic slowdowns we were in. When he died from cancer in his 50s, he'd been working as a telemarketer. It was a tough job. His son, who was handling the arrangements, told me his father had been a seeker. He didn't know who God was, and he was actually very suspicious of organized religion. But he always wanted to find out more about him, and then the son told me why. His dad had been in Vietnam. Once he was with a group of soldiers who were going to, leave on a mission on a helicopter. And at the last second, a friend of his said he would take his place because he had subbed for this man on an earlier mission, and now he said he was ready to repay the favor. So the son told me his father stepped out of the helicopter seconds before takeoff, and the friend got on. The helicopter went up a ways, it had a mechanical problem, it crashed, and everyone on board was killed. His dad had always wondered why his life was spared, and what it was that God had wanted him to do with his life, and he never felt quite sure. We never know in this world why circumstances turn out the way they do. I think this man was right to wonder. Wonder is close to awe, the emotion of feeling God's presence. But in this world, we walk by faith and not by sight. We don't know exactly what we're here for, but we know that God is good and we must be good too. In some ways, it's as simple as that. As for what God's plan for us is, that there's an old hymn that says, we'll understand it better by and by. In the meantime, may the Lord bless the soul of this man and also of his friend who had the misfortune to take his place on that fateful day. We went to Boston on vacation after Christmas in 2001. We went there for a couple of nights. I'll explain in a moment how I happen to remember the year. Violetta said the Chinatown there reminded her of home. Peter loved the mall in Copley Square. Malls were still big in those days. So we did that actually for a number of years right around then. We were staying that year on the 8th floor of a Back Bay hotel. We'd been there after Christmas the previous year, and the ice machines were only on every other floor. Violetta had bought a lot of food in Chinatown that day, and we were keeping it on ice. The ice had melted overnight. I was up before everybody else and decided to go down a flight and get another bucket of ice. In years past, at the same hotel, you just walk down the stairwell, so I went through that door as I had the previous year. But this was just a couple of months after 9/11, and they'd tightened security in the building. Now the stairwell was for emergency use only. Once you'd gone through the door, you couldn't open any door from inside the stairwell. So when I went out the door, it locked behind me, and I couldn't access the floor below, and I couldn't get back to my own floor. So rather than pound on the door in a sleepy hotel, I thought I'd go down, all the way down the stair and see if the stair opened up in the lobby or in the parking garage. So I walked down, and there was a door there, but it said, emergency use only, alarm will sound. Well, I didn't want to walk through that. And then I realized at that point a bit of good luck. I still had my cell phone on me. I could call Violetta, she would just let me in the door since it, of course, opened from the hallway. So while walking up 8 flights of stairs, I called her on her cell phone. Now you have to remember, Violetta's not a quick waker-upper. Her voice was sleepy. In fact, she answered in Tagalog, which is the language of the Philippines, the language she had grown up with. By that point, I was huffing and puffing, so I sounded like I was being chased by a grizzly bear. This woke her up. Where are you? What's happened? What's wrong? I tried to explain. Door? What door? Stairwell? What are you doing in a stairwell? I told her where the door was. Eventually, I got back onto our floor. I just skipped the ice. I began writing my annual report. I always begin it a little early because I want to make sure I don't leave anyone out. And in it so far, I've certainly have mentioned both Floyd Welch, who was the last Pearl Harbor survivor from Connecticut, and also Ellen Sawicki, who came to this area as a war bride after World War II. Seeing that it was Veterans Day this past week, I decided in today's sound test and in the next few ones to pass along a few other experiences of World War II, which I heard here as a pastor. A lot of you will remember Jim Johnson, who served as a volunteer custodian here for many years. Jim, who was a pretty unlikely soldier, was never under fire, but he passed along these 2 experiences to me. The first was that when he arrived in France, he and another man set up a 2-man tent, and they did so in what he said was the hardest rainfall he'd ever experienced. He said it was like trying to assemble something while standing under a waterfall. Later in the war, in Germany, he and a group of GIs came across an abandoned German truck. One of his comrades was able to hotwire the truck, and since it was raining, they were glad to drive rather than walk. The problem was the windows began steaming up, and no one could figure out where the defroster was. They tried every knob on the dashboard, and nothing seemed to work. So finally, they stopped the truck, and with their rifle butts, they smashed the windshield and finished their drive like that. Herb Burdick was an even more unlikely soldier than Jim. I visited him, many times at his home in Niantic over the years, and we would talk about birds and flowers, really his 2 favorite subjects. Herb was a cook stationed in the South Pacific. He was a good cook. Actually, he'd been a cook before the war. And food is an important part of morale, so he was actually very popular in his outfit. Those of you who have been members for a long time remember that he walked with a cane and always had cotton in his ears. Both the balance problem and the cotton related to an ear problem, which was the result of a fungus infection that he had picked up in the South Pacific, which he was treating actually all the rest of his life. And I'll close by mentioning two other men who actually were in combat. Saul Condenzio was somebody whom I knew through the Seventh-day Baptist Church in Waterford. That's that tiny church on Great Neck Road. Like Jim and Herb, Saul was an unlikely soldier, another kindly, lovable, very sweet-tempered man. Saul was short and slight, but there are a lot of jobs which are tailor-made for people like that. In civilian life, they're coxswains or jockeys. But in the military, they're put inside a tank, where, of course, there's not much room in there, so small men are, of course, much better than large ones. I mentioned George Patton in today's sermon. Saul served in his unit, the Third Army, and was awarded a Purple Heart for wounds he received after his tank hit a mine. The last one I'll mention is Joe Ziska. All the others I mentioned today were really sweet individuals whom I knew through churches. Joe was a genuinely tough guy. I mean, if you were honest and decent, Joe was your best friend in the world. He was very fond of my dad. He was also a good friend to both Joe Selden and Lou Bull. But I tell you, if you weren't straight with him, you never had a worse enemy. He was in the Marine Corps in the Second World War, and at Okinawa he was on a patrol, and a woman rushed out of a hidden cave, held a pistol to his head, and pulled the trigger, and the gun misfired. Lou told me, and Joe Selden confirmed, that he had a steel plate in his head from his war days, but they didn't know how he got it. Joe was the type of person, when he told you something, you listened and you remembered it, but you didn't ask a lot of fool questions. He was a lobsterman, and he loved hunting. And on his grave in the East Lyme Cemetery are the very fitting words of Robert Louis Stevenson: "Home is the sailor home from sea, and the hunter home from the hill." These were all ordinary individuals. Jim worked in a local factory. Herb was a bank teller. Saul was a roofer. Joe was a fisherman. Typical Americans, all from this area. Over the years, I've done countless funerals for veterans of World War II. It occurred to me after the service for Floyd Welch, who died this past summer at age 99, that I might never do one again. So in these sound tests, both last week and next week today, I thought I would mention a few of the stories of World War II that I've heard. Pete Hunt was a longtime head of the finance board at this church. He told me he went to basic training and said that we were from a variety of backgrounds, but the sergeant called every one of us the same thing: dog face. After that, after he finished basic training, he was called in by his commanding officer, who said, "Hunt, how would you like to be a radio man?" Pete replied, "Thank you very much, sir, but I like the job I have right now, sir, and I don't want to change." He was dismissed. The next day he was called back by his commanding officer, who said, "Hunt, you're a radio man," and he was sent to school for that. I mentioned in a recent sermon how Pete served in Normandy, and because he had begun college, he'd started learning a little French, so he was put in charge of buying eggs and straw from local farmers. The straw was for GIs to sleep on. He said that the same farmers were selling to him, who were also selling to the Germans at the time. Later, he was in at the Battle of the Bulge. This battle affected a number of people who were in or around this church. George Stevens, whose family attended here when I was a child, and also Frank Barnes, who was a friend of Bert's and also of my dad's, were both captured by the Germans in that battle and became POWs. Alwyn Broderson was in charge of a detail burying bodies at that battle. And since it took place at Christmas, Brody said that the experience had always cast a shadow for him on that holiday. Pete himself had a serious case of frostbite. I think he had a Purple Heart for it, and was sent to a hospital in England. So once again, ordinary people from this area, caught up in extraordinary events. I thought that now that the World War II generation has almost all passed away, it might be a good time to pass along a few of the stories I heard from them. And I thought I'd close out this brief series with what happened to Jumbo Seckel, who was a friend of my dad's. And I honestly can't remember now if he told me this himself or if I got it secondhand from my father. And if anybody else who knows the story sees I've gotten any details wrong, please let me know, because part of doing history is getting it right. But it's a good story, and this is what I remember. Jumbo was in the Navy. He was on a submarine stationed in the South Pacific. One night, the skipper looked out the telescope, and he could see debris floating on the water. And in amongst the debris were men wearing life jackets. So he decided he would surface and find out what had happened. They brought on deck a rubber raft, which had room for two, and the skipper took Jumbo along with him because, as you can tell by his nickname, he was a big man. The skipper was going to be busy with the oars, and he said to Jumbo, "If they're ours, we'll rescue them, but if they turn out to be Japanese, kill them." And he pressed a .45 pistol into his hand. Now, Jumbo had joined the Navy at 17. At this point, he was barely 19, so you can imagine his feelings at this point, and they paddled off into the night. Well, it turned out that the men were English, so they paddled back to the sub, and the skipper tied a rope around Jumbo's waist. He said, "We wouldn't want to lose you." And he told him to swim as straight as he could out into the darkness. And with a flashlight in one hand and the compass in the other, the skipper was measuring out so many degrees in a circle to make sure they got everyone in that, of course, very dark night. And Jumbo was a good swimmer, would swim out anytime he found someone in a life jacket. He would pull them back to the sub. And they rescued a lot of sailors who had been aboard a freighter which had been torpedoed by the Japanese. And Jumbo said that a number of times over the years they'd had reunions of the sub and the survivors. Again, and this will be the last one in this little series, ordinary people from around here, extraordinary events. I've been telling stories about my years in the ministry during these sound tests, and Mike now has recorded so many of them that I kind of gone through them all, so I thought I would go back to telling children's stories at these times. Though they're aimed at young people, I'll admit that one reason for doing so is I enjoy telling them. There was once upon a time a young prince who had been raised with the idea that he was going to become king of his country. And so he learned how to ride horses and fight with broadswords and hunt with falcons and do all those kinds of things that royalty does. But the world sometimes changes beneath our feet, and the prince who had been raised to be a king grew up in a nation that had become a democracy with elections, TV ads, sound bites, and attack ads. And though he might have been a good leader if given a chance, he was certainly no politician, and he was out of a job before he was old enough even to begin. So the prince went to the court wizard and asked what he should do. And the wizard said that the prince had two great inheritances, and that if he used them correctly, his life would work out just fine. Now, the prince had a rich aunt on one side of his family and a rich uncle on the other, and he figured that the wizard must be referring to them. So he was surprised when the aunt died and she left all her money to a home for sick and elderly cats. And when his uncle died, he had no money at all in his estate because he'd gambled it all away at the casino. So he figured that the wizard simply hadn't known what he was talking about. And he sat down, very unhappy, wondering what he was going to do next. And when he did so, he looked at his hands, and suddenly the answer to the riddle came to him. The two great inheritances he had were his two hands. He could work with them and make his own way through the world. And if you think about it, your hands really are a marvelous gift. You can become a surgeon and do operations and save people's lives. You can learn how to play a musical instrument. The great Russian pianist Rachmaninoff, when he was dying, thanked his hands for all that they had done for him during his life. You can become a carpenter, and with a few simple tools, your hands can turn a pile of lumber and nails into a house. We can type up our thoughts and put them into words. We can draw pictures, and the more carefully we draw and look at the pictures we've made, the more we'll understand the world around us. So we can teach our hands to do marvels, and in fact, they're at their best when they're learning or when they're doing something. So they're a gift from God. So let's learn skills and let them show us what they can do. Once upon a time, a little girl went for a walk, and she saw an elf walking by. Even though the girl was small, the elf, as it turned out, was smaller. He had green hair. He had a pipe, which he was smoking upside down, like you sometimes see in Ireland. Then the little girl noticed something fell out of the elf's pocket. It was a little green cat made out of brass. And she hurried after the elf. She wanted to give it back, trying to call his name, but he moved too quickly, and soon he was out of sight. She noticed there were tiny little whiskers on the cat, and she pulled them in kind of an absent-minded kind of way, and all of a sudden she was fabulously rich. She had limousines and servants and jewels, and she thought, this is great. But the reason I'm not going to pull those whiskers myself is that when she tried to speak, all she could say was, meow. Now, fortunately, when she pulled on the whiskers again, she turned back into a little girl and was able to talk again. And of course, at that point, the limos and the wealth was all gone. The lesson I would take from this is that people sometimes seek for money or success, and they become something they don't want to be in the process. Maybe they don't turn into a cat. I have to admit I've never seen that happen. But maybe they end up selfish or greedy or hard or untruthful. Like failure, success is a test of who we are. Some, when they become rich and secure, forget all about the God whom they knew when they were poor and afraid. And that's a mistake. So I hope that whatever you put your hand to, that you achieve success, but you do want to make sure that your soul does not get lost in the process. Once upon a time, there was a kingdom that had a minor problem, which I'll describe to you. The army marched out of step, and when it was on parade, it looked a little ragged. A lieutenant who was fresh from officer training school came along and said, these guys need discipline. And he set them to polishing their buttons and doing parade ground routines, and pretty soon they looked very smart and much more military. But the problem was they were so very tired out after all this drilling that the Huns, when they invaded, easily defeated them. In the same kingdom, there was a marching band and a new director who decided he was a little bored with just playing songs. So he arranged the band so they spelled out words or they looked like the American flag, and it did liven things up at halftime. But they neglected to practice their music, and the problem was pretty soon they sounded awful. The fire company in the kingdom hadn't gotten hoses and trucks for a long time, so the new chief went out and brought marvelous new equipment, so they were ready for anything. It was expensive, and having all that expensive equipment made the chief nervous, so he locked it up tight so that it would be secure. But then when he went on vacation, he forgot to give the key to the captain so that when the fire broke out, nobody could open up the equipment. It's possible, in other words, to make all sorts of arrangements and yet miss the point. America does this every year at Christmas. They put up terrific displays, they make shopping lists, they check them twice, they send out cards, and they forget Jesus of Nazareth. So let's not fall into that trap. Let's be sure and praise the name of Jesus Christ at this Christmas. I got a nice handwritten note from one of my friends at the Grassy Hill Church, and in the note they said, I hope Zazie is better. And I looked at it and I was trying to remember, as I'm often doing when people are talking to me, they're saying something and I probably should know, but I'm having a little trouble picking it up. And I was trying to remember who Zazie was. Was it their family pet? Was this some kind of foreign name for like a grandmother? And I was thinking and thinking. Finally, I realized it actually was not Zazie. It was 2021. They were saying, I hope 2021 is better. So this is why when you get notes from me, they're so often typed. Once upon a time, there was a gingerbread man who was so made that he felt that with just a little push, he could become alive. The only thing he needed was to have lasting feelings in his heart, and then he was sure he'd become human. And he thought, where do people go to experience feelings? How about the movies? So he went to the movies and he laughed at some and he cried at others. But just like all the other people who leave movie theaters, the feelings did not last long. Then he said, well, how about if I fall in love? So he did. The first day he fell in love with a Madeline cookie. The second he fell in love with kind of a languid girl called a Lazy Susan. But his love did not last, and he did not come to life, and the gingerbread man was discouraged. But then, unexpectedly, the gingerbread man fell in love with the brown Betty, really quite a sweet kid. And this time, he cared about somebody else more than himself, and it turned out that that made all the difference, and their love brought both of them to life. And one thing I notice is that people often feel something, but they don't really mean it. One day you're a friend, and the next day they play a mean joke on you. Some people you see chumming around one day and then hating each other the next. Their feelings don't last. And that's not good with regard to people, but much worse with regard to God. If our relationship to God is to mean anything, the feeling for us has to last, just as it did for the gingerbread. And then it's us who come to life. Once upon a time, there were two lands, a land of fire and a land of ice. And they'd come up with some kind of quarrel, and the two of them would have at it and fight. And ordinary people would be caught in between and suffer in the midst of it. In the winter, it looked like ice would win. In the summer, it looked like fire was going to win. Neither, however, got the upper hand. Now, some people in the tribe took fire's side. They said fire really is what the better side of all this is. Some people took the side of ice. But the cook of the tribe discovered that each had a strength. Food tasted better if it was cooked, so she would borrow fire in order to make supper. She also discovered that produce and eggs and meat always kept a lot better if it was on ice, so she would borrow cold whenever she put groceries away. She told fire and ice that if they fought with each other, neither would ever win, and there would be a lot of suffering along the way. But if they worked together on a project, cooking just being one example, that they actually made a good team. So too, Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers. They shall be called children of God." Once upon a time, there were two brothers. One was the king, and his brother was the duke. And the duke had his own castle, but he bitterly resented the fact that he was not the king. He'd say he was loyal, but he was angry that his brother was on the throne, not him. And while his brother, the king, was busy learning about law and diplomacy, his brother, the duke, in his younger days, learned some simple magic. What he learned is he could make anything sound just impossible, and then he hatched a plan. Once the king was out hunting by himself, and the brother sent some of his henchmen to kidnap him, and the king was locked in a dungeon, and people said, "Where's the king?" And the duke said, "Well, now I guess I have to become king. The king's not around." And any time anyone suggested looking for the king, the duke would use his magic to talk people out of it. Now, the king's daughter decided she would try to find her father, and she decided she would go to her uncle, the duke, and see what he knew about all this. But before she left the court, the wizard gave her a bit of advice. When the duke frowned, she should smile, and when the duke scowled, she should laugh. She went to the castle, and the duke, as usual, tried to persuade her that it was useless to look for the king, that a lot of people had tried, that nobody had gotten anywhere, that the whole thing was a waste of time. But even though she was feeling quite discouraged because of the effects of this magic, she remembered the advice that she had been given, and the king's daughter began to smile. The smile angered the duke, who scowled, and again he repeated that looking for his brother was a waste of time. And when she saw the scowl, she remembered the advice again and laughed and said, "Let's give it a try." The spell was broken, and everyone in the room, in the courtroom there, and surrounding the king, all of them perked up. And people in the court began to ask questions, and soon the rightful king was found and released. We live in a time of a spreading virus, but I will say cheerfulness is also something that can be contagious. So is faith that's something that can be contagious. Let's by all means control the virus, but let's spread faith and cheerfulness around. I remember a story I heard a long time ago. I have to admit now I've forgotten where I originally heard it, but it went like this. Once upon a time, there was a proud king in Sicily named Robert. They were doing some renovations in the castle. They tore down an old wall, and behind it they saw an inscription in Latin. Robert should have known what it said, since Latin was taught in school in those days, but he was not much of a student, so he asked a monk who was near him to translate it for him, and it turned out to be a quotation from Luke 1:52. God takes down the mighty from their thrones and exalts those of low degree. Well, I'm glad it's in Latin, said Robert, because it's a lie. No power in the world could take my throne away. Later that morning, he went to church. In those days, kings had to go to church, and he fell asleep during the sermon. I'm told that kind of thing does happen now and then. And he woke up and found himself all alone in a dark church. Now, his guards were not supposed to allow him to be in a room by himself for security reasons, so he was very angry. He ran to the palace, and as he entered, there was a mirror on the wall, and to his surprise, Robert saw that his hair was long and unkempt, and that he was dressed in rags. He ran past the guards and into the throne room, and to his surprise, there was someone else on the throne who looked just like him. Turned out it was a double. It was like what the Germans call a doppelganger, someone who looked exactly like him. Robert said, "That man is an imposter. I'm the real king." The king's guards would have killed him for saying that, but the king stopped them. He said that Robert, of course, was not the king, but he could stay on there if he liked as the court jester. And when Robert saw that was the only way he had to stay alive, he agreed to act as one. So he wore a dunce cap and he slept on straw. But when the two of them were alone together, the king would say to him, "Who are you?" And Robert would say, "I'm the true king. You're an imposter. Give me my throne back." Then the king would get angry and call the guards in and say that the jester had said enough for that day and make him go away. And what made the whole thing worse for Robert was that this new king was just and kind, and everyone liked him much better than they had ever liked him. As the days went by, Robert remembered those words about how God puts down the mighty from their thrones and exalts those of low degree. And for the first time in his life, he was sorry, not because he didn't have his old luxuries and his throne back, but because he hadn't been a better king. The next day, the king asked him again, "Who are you?" And Robert said, "I don't know anymore. All I know is I have sinned." And he lowered his head, sorry that he had wasted so many opportunities that had been given to him. When he raised his head again, he saw not the king, not even a man, but an angel. And the angel said, "Now I am no longer Robert. You are Robert again." And Robert found himself alone with his robes on once more. And when his servants returned, they found the king kneeling by his throne in prayer. Once upon a time, there was a princess named Olga, whom I regret to say was spoiled and proud. She wouldn't do her chores or speak respectfully to her elders because, being raised as a princess, she had been used to getting her way. Olga liked many things, but above all, she liked beautiful rings and bracelets. One time she decided to skip her music lesson. The music teacher, who had walked 2 miles to the house, to the castle to give it, had just had to turn around and walk home. And instead she rode her horse into the king's forest simply because her father had forbidden her to go there, since father thought it was dangerous. There were all sorts of unusual types in that forest. And there Olga met a young girl who was dressed in rags, but who had a very beautiful necklace around her neck with a jewel in the middle of it. Olga was very envious and wanted the necklace, and that put her in a bad temper. And she said, "How dare you go into the king's forest without permission?" Even though Olga was in fact in there without permission too. The girl said, "But the forest does not belong to the king. It belongs to me." This made Olga angry, and she reached down from her horse and struck the girl with a riding crop. It's kind of a small whip you use when you're riding. When Olga saw the welt that was raised on the girl, she felt bad about what she had done, but she was too proud to apologize, and she told the girl to be gone, and indeed the girl disappeared. Olga at that point looked down because she felt something around her neck, and it turned out to be the beautiful necklace which the girl had been wearing, except now it was missing the gem that had been in the middle. Even without the gem, it was lovely, and she was pleased to have it. Back at the castle, everyone complimented it. But there was a problem. It fit so snugly that she could not take it off, and she found that she could not break it either. And every time Olga did something arrogant, every time she looked down her nose at someone, or beat a servant, or teased the plainness of another woman at the court, the necklace with the missing stone got heavier and heavier. And soon it became something of a chore to lift her head up, but everyone complimented the necklace with the missing stone. The story becomes sad at this point because a few years passed and Olga married a husband who turned out to be no good. He drank too much. Then their only child died. With all her sorrows, Olga decided she didn't care as much as she used to about beautiful things. One day her husband was off drinking with his friends, and Olga knew from bitter experience that it would be days before she saw him again. So she went into the forest to see that if she could find the girl in rags. And she searched for many, many hours, and finally she did find her. She went on her knees before her and said, "I'm sorry I struck you. Please take this necklace from me. I can't bear to wear it anymore, regardless of how beautiful it is." And the girl said, "Behold, I am the queen of the forest. What I give, I cannot take back. But because you are different, now the necklace is different too." Olga looked, and instead of the missing stone, there was indeed a gem now in the center of the necklace. It was just as beautiful to wear, but now every time she was humble or faithful or kind, the necklace got lighter. Soon it was no longer a burden, it was an ornament. So it is with God. When we bow our knees before him, he lightens our burdens and turns them into joys. The elephants we see now all come from Africa, but America used to have creatures called woolly mammoths and mastodons, which were very like elephants. The lions we see now all come from Africa, and tigers all come from India. But America used to have its own lions and also saber-toothed tigers. All the horses in America now, including the ones the Native Americans rode in the days of the Wild West, are descended from European horses. But once America had a native population of horses all its own. So you see, America used to have all sorts of large mammals, but most of them died out about the same time. This was about 10,000 years ago. No one knows for sure why, but the guess is that at that time, people immigrated to North America for the first time over a land bridge which existed at that time between Siberia and Alaska. And when they came over, most of the mammals were hunted, big mammals were hunted to extinction, sort of an early example of what human beings can do to their environment. Africa still has a lot of large mammals like elephants and rhinos. It has also fierce predators like lions and leopards. Why weren't they hunted to extinction in Africa? And the answer is probably mosquitoes. Mosquitoes spread diseases that kept human beings out of areas, and as a result, some regions were very rarely or very lightly settled. So in a way, great big elephants and fierce lions rely on mosquitoes to survive. The largest turn out to need the smallest. When I was young and growing up, I used to grow fruit trees, and we needed bees to pollinate the apples. And when someone found a bee's nest, my uncle would carefully move it over to our property. So the large and the small, who often seem so different, actually need each other. So it's a serious mistake to look down on others, or even more so to misuse them. The great need those whom they regard as the small. Ask any woolly mammoth. What we need to be in our own families, or in the school cafeteria, or in our job sites, are those peacemakers who bring people together because we all need each other. In the days of knights and castles, when the king sat down at the table, he was always the first one to be served. And when it came time to go from one room to another, the king was always the first one who was allowed to go through the door. Most tables were rectangular, like this one, except they were longer, with two places of honor, one at the head and one at the foot, one for the king and one for the queen. Everything else was decided by something called precedence. If the king was the first one through the door when supper was announced, well, who was supposed to be the second one? Would it be the king's top soldier, or the mayor of the city, or the king's chamberlain, his top advisor? Who got to go first, a prince, a duke, or a count? Or, to put this in modern terms, who is more important, the singer prince, actor John the Duke Wayne, or jazz musician Count Basie? There were disagreements about who got to sit next to the king and who had to sit farther down the table, below the salt, as they used to say. Sometimes this led to duels and sword fights. But when Arthur became King of England, he decided to change all that. First, he instituted the Knights of the Round Table. At a round table, of course, no one is at the head. Everyone is an equal. And by reading the gospel, Arthur saw that the one who leads must be the servant of all, and he would allow other people to go through the door before him, and he wouldn't eat until all the guests were served. He called this chivalry, but nowadays, of course, we simply call it good manners. And to this day, if the waiter brings you out your soup first, you wait until the others at the table have their soup before you pick up your spoon and begin eating. But the seat directly across from Arthur was kept empty, and it was called the seat perilous, because no one was allowed to sit in it except Jesus Christ himself. And Merlin said that if anyone else got into that seat, they would die. So really, all people are equals, each with our own strengths and our own faults, our own sorrows. We should treat each other as equals. The only true king we have is Jesus Christ himself. Once there was a writer in France named Honoré de Balzac who wrote a book, and he mailed it to a publisher. And the publisher loved the book and thought it might make a lot of money. So he and his partner were talking about paying Balzac $5,000 for it. But when he looked at the return address on the manuscript, he saw that Balzac came from a poor neighborhood, and so he figured, well, if he's such a poor man, he can't be worth all that much. And he and his partner decided to lower the fee to $2,500. So he took his checkbook out to where Balzac lived, and the apartment was run down looking, and he thought to himself, I bet $1,000 will be plenty. He went to the apartment. A shabby-looking man answered. The publisher thought it was the butler, but it turned out to be Balzac himself, and he looked so down at the heels that the publisher thought of abandoning the plan to bring the book out at all. As it was, he only gave him a check for $500, but Balzac was so poor he was glad to get it. When the book was put on the market, it was a runaway bestseller, made a lot of money for the publisher. It was one of those rare books that was liked both by ordinary people and the critics too. Balzac was a poor man. He was living hand to mouth, but was a great writer. When Jesus Christ came to this world, he did not look like a king. He was a poor man, and there were many on that basis who would have been too proud to follow him. So too, today there are those who are too proud to look in an ordinary Bible or go to an ordinary church for spiritual guidance. But often the greatest treasures are found by those who are willing to look beneath the surface. Children's story. Once upon a time, the queen decided that the prince needed to have a dog. The same way that people seem to be either Republicans or Democrats, or Red Sox fans or Yankee fans, so too they seem to be either dog people or cat people. And the queen was one of those people who liked cats, which meant she really didn't know what to look for in a dog. So she asked the sergeant at arms, and also her chamberlain, and also the court physician to find a dog for the prince. The sergeant at arms figured the most important thing was to find a dog that would protect the prince. Guards are most often going to be falling asleep at night, and that's when kidnappers are most apt to strike. The sergeant at arms thought that what they needed was a dog that would sound the alarm if there was any kind of intruder. The chamberlain thought it was pretty unlikely they'd ever have a kidnapper at the palace. He said, princes don't play baseball or ride bicycles. The thing that princes do is they go hunting. So what he needs is a good hunting dog, which will flush out game or retrieve it after it's been shot. And, that's going to be a sound investment for him. The court physician then spoke up. He said he was familiar with royal health. The prince's main problem really was going to be loneliness. Because everyone bowed to the prince and no one was allowed to talk to him like an equal, he didn't mix much with other kids, and he was a little slow to learn how to make friends. What he needed was a dog to be his companion. So they all made their case to the queen, who decided that the thing to do was for the prince to own more than one dog. Beauty contests have one winner, and so do ball games and political elections, but they give us a wrong sense of the way the world works. You don't have to be like every other child, and you don't have to do well what they do well. Not everyone is a bright student or a star athlete or a singer. Not everyone is popular or beautiful or funny. But there are lots of things the rest of us are glad to see well done. All we need to do simply is to find something that we're good at and do that for everyone else around us. I'm going to tell you a story about Susie, and the thing to remember about Susie is that she was a cool customer. She wanted to buy a house. I don't know if your parents have ever been in that position. It's not easy. If the price is fine, the neighborhood may not be so good. If it's in a nice neighborhood, maybe the building needs a lot of work. If it doesn't need a lot of work, maybe the style is wrong. If the style is fine, maybe it's too near the road and it's a little noisy. And if it's on a quiet street, then maybe the man next door is learning how to play the bagpipes. In other words, it's always going to be something. Now, Susie had found what she thought was going to be a perfect house for herself. There seemed to be nothing wrong with it, but there turned out to be a big problem. It was haunted. That's why the price was so low. Now, if this was an average tale, it would turn out that there was no ghost, since both you and I know there's no such thing as ghosts. And this would end up being like an episode of Scooby-Doo, where Susie would be exposing some kind of fraud. But this is not an average tale, because in fact there was a ghost. At first, Susie heard it rapping in the night. And if you heard a noise from a dark room, you might be reluctant to go there with a flashlight in the middle of the night to see what it was. But as I said, Susie was a cool customer. She saw the ghost rapping on the wall, and when the ghost saw her, the ghost actually removed his head from his shoulders and put it down by his hip there. And personally, at this point, I would have run away. But what did I say about Susie? She was a cool customer. And she said to the ghost, "What are you rapping for?" And the ghost, instead of answering, uttered this unearthly moan, which again, I would have headed for the door at that point. But Susie, that cool customer, said, "How do you talk when your head is way down there and your throat is way up here?" And the ghost said, it was harder than you might think. And he explained that he was actually trying to fan air through it with his nose, but with his hand rather. But of course, anyone who explains to you how clever they are is not all that intimidating. It ends up being more like a friend who is showing you some new app on their phone. The ghost said to Susie, "Why aren't you scared?" Susie replied, "Well, you aren't very scary." And the ghost said, "How about if I shake my chains that I have here with me?" And she shook her head and said, "What do you want to scare me for anyway?" The ghost replied, "This is my house, and I frighten other people out of it." And Susie said, "What's the use of living beyond the grave if you hang around this place all by yourself? Since you can move through walls, you should find a nicer home. And you could also find other ghosts and make friends." And soon the ghost was convinced, and the two of them lived together in peace. Sometimes you'll notice people have quarrels, and like the ghost, they're unable to move on, the same way that ghost couldn't, leave that house. They can't seem to let go of some old squabble they have. But my advice to you is to be like Susie and be a cool customer. Talk to the person who's at odds with you. One of my favorite sayings of Abraham Lincoln is this: "The best way to destroy an enemy is to make him your friend." Once upon a time, there was a king who lost a battle, and the enemy forces surrounded his city. He had no idea what to do. There was in the city a peasant who worked in the stable, taking care of the pigs. He was called the Pig Man, and the nickname was unfair because the pig man did not look like a pig. In fact, he looked a lot like the king. This was indeed so true that when the siege was going badly, the pig man went to the king and said that when he would volunteer to put on the king's clothes and impersonate the king when the enemy soldiers broke into the city. Meanwhile, the king could put on the smelly old clothes of the pig man and hide out in the stable. It was a desperate plan, but the king did not have a better one, and so he tried it. The enemy forces entered the city and arrived and arrested the one who was pretending to be king and put him in a dungeon. This was not quite as bad as you might think, because the pig man was used to hard knocks. The king, meanwhile, was working away, slopping the pigs and cleaning up the stables. And someday I'll tell you how he came back to the throne and released the pig man from his captivity. But in the meantime, the soldiers guarding the king thought it was strange that the king ate with his elbows on the table and wiped his mouth on his sleeve and slurped his soup. Meanwhile, the staff down at the pigsty was surprised that the man they thought was the pig man never complained, never swore, and always said please and thank you. Sometimes being in this world is like working down in the pigsty. At school, you'll certainly run into people who say and do all sorts of things that they would never be allowed to do in your house. You don't have to be judge of anyone else or tell them how to live, but you can at least be like the king in today's lesson and live in a way that's better than your surroundings. Once upon a time, a king had 3 children. The king died, and the law was that the oldest one was supposed to rule, so it was his daughter who became the rightful queen of the land. But her twin younger brothers were jealous, and the better the queen ruled, the more jealous that they got. So whenever the queen did something good for the people of the land, out of envy and spite, her 2 younger brothers would do something wicked. And unfortunately, they had learned along the way to be magicians, and so that spelled trouble. Now, the younger brother, who was an earl, was bad, but his magic was clumsy and obvious. He would cause rain on festive days, or create blights that damaged the peasants' harvests, or send epidemics to torment the population. And when the earl came to town, everybody was ready. They were on guard. But his older brother, he'd been born just slightly earlier, his older brother, the Duke, was more cunning. He gave the peasants gifts which at first seemed good, but which caused all sorts of troubles. He gave the peasants alcohol so that they were merry, and at first they were glad, but some of them ended up drunks. He gave them machines and tools which made their lives easier, but soon the peasants learned to use these machines to build ingenious weapons, which meant that their wars became much more deadly. The queen did her best to offset the harm that the earl caused, but the harm the duke caused remained quite a serious problem. There are different types of sin in the world, and some are obvious. Everybody knows it's bad to steal or lie or kill. But sometimes the best gifts can be misused. God gives us strength and intends it to be a good gift, but some use it to be bullies or tyrants. God wants us to work hard in school and be bright, but this makes some people proud and snobbish. God gave us faith in Him, but some end up judgmental like the Pharisees. Even the good gifts that we are given can be used in a bad way. I'll tell you a story by Willa Cather. Just after the Civil War, 2 Roman Catholic missionaries from France were making their way to Santa Fe, which is, of course, now it's the capital of New Mexico. Then it was just a village. At that time, priests were in short supply in the Southwest, and the Indian and Spanish population there were glad to get one. Many couples wanted to get married in the church or baptize their children. But even if a priest was willing to serve in one of these remote villages, it was hard to get there. Maps of the area were few and inaccurate. The roads were in terrible shape. The Mexicans they talked to on the isolated ranches they passed had rarely gone more than a dozen miles in any one direction, so sometimes they didn't know how to get to Santa Fe either, and at other times their directions were just simply wrong. Desert climates have downpours now and then, and the two priests got soaking wet in one, and then the temperature dropped, and so they were shivering with cold. They couldn't light a fire, everything was just too wet. And they couldn't lay their blankets on the ground and go to sleep because the blankets would just get wet. So they kept going, and they came across a simple hut in the wilderness. A white man lived there together with the Mexican woman. The man had a hard face, and they didn't much like the way he looked at them and at their animals, but they didn't feel they had much of a choice, so they asked for hospitality. When the Mexican woman came out to serve them, she whispered something to them in Spanish, but at this point they didn't as yet know Spanish, they only knew French and English. She urgently pointed in the direction of her husband, who was putting the horses away, and then they made a motion like that across her throat, indicating that her husband was going to kill them, of course steal their animals, and she pointed urgently away. And of course they understood that. The priests talked quietly together in French. One asked the other if he still had his pistol, and he said, yes, but it got wet, it won't fire. Meanwhile, the husband had come back. The older priest said to him in English that they'd decided to continue on after all and to bring their horses back out, and they said they'd give him a few coins for his trouble. The man got angry, so my hospitality's not good enough for you. They still politely replied that they were leaving. He began cursing them and pulled out a knife. The older priest pulled out his revolver and motioned for the man to get the horses. By the flickering candlelight, the man could see the gun, but not the fact that it wasn't primed right. The older priest asked with his eyes if the wife wanted to go with them, and she answered by climbing on back of one of the horses. Riding off, she pointed out where her family was from, and they dropped her off at a village, a day or two later. From that village, they were able to get the directions for the remainder of their trip. The Gospels tell us, not simply to repent so that we may save our soul, but also to rescue those who are held captive. As long as anyone in this world is suffering the consequences of sin, there will be a role for the Christian church. I'm going to tell you about the only time I've ever had a conversation with a celebrity. In the spring of 2002, the chaplain at Connecticut College quit in the middle of the semester. The organist at the college knew me and asked if I could fill out the year, and I did so, holding services on Sunday afternoons. At the end of the year, the college also asked if I would give the invocation at their graduation ceremony, so I did that too. And I can tell you the date that took place, May 25th. I'll tell you the reason I know the date in just a moment. The faculty members and other guests changed in a room that was locked up by security, and they left their various jackets and purses there. Since the faculty was wearing ceremonial robes, I wore my robe as well, and so I left my jacket there too. The reason I remember the date of the ceremony is that it was my son's birthday, and we were having a party with guests coming over, so I was anxious to get home. The highlight of the ceremony that morning was Joyce Carol Oates was receiving an honorary degree. Now, I have to admit, I've never read any of her novels. Not everyone likes her work. Critic Gore Vidal said the three most depressing words in the English language were Joyce Carol Oates. But she's a well-known contemporary author, and it's always interesting to see someone famous. Graduations always seem to last a lot longer than they actually do, but it finally was over, and I saw that if I hurried, I could still make my son's party. So I made a beeline for the room in which I'd left my jacket, but when I got there, the door was still locked. The security hadn't shown up yet. Right behind me was the only other person who wanted to get out of there as much as I did, and that was, of course, Joyce Carol Oates. We looked at each other, and she went like this. And I said, "Locked." It occurred to me this might be my one chance to have a conversation with a famous person, but I couldn't think of anything else to say. We were, of course, both strangers, and so we had nothing really to talk about. So we just both stood there, shifting from one foot to the other until security finally showed up and unlocked the door. On Easter, Jesus came and he opened that locked door, which is marked death. And he can do the same for you and me, but there is a catch. He won't open the door to a stranger. If we won't have anything to say to each other, if he doesn't know us and we don't know him, we won't enter. So the time to become a friend of Jesus Christ is right now. And we must do so by the way we live, by the faith that we have, and by the way that we treat each other. Back when I was in school, I read an ancient Latin novel by a man named Apuleius, in which a young man named Lucius runs into trouble trying out a magic spell that used hair. My professor at the time, who was originally from South Africa, said as a child he remembered that when country people had a haircut or trimmed their nails, they would always burn whatever they cut off so that it could not be used in a spell against them. And this tale explains why something like that might have been so. In the story, Lucius was staying as a guest at a home belonging to an older friend. The maid in the house told Lucius that the old woman was a witch. Later that night, Lucius peeped through a keyhole, and the mistress of the house took a small pile of hair and cast a spell over it and turned from an old woman into a young man. Later that evening, she came back and cast another spell and changed back into herself. Lucius, who had been scarred by smallpox and walked with a limp, was very impressed by this magic and figured he could improve his looks if he tried a little bit of the same. Since he'd heard the spell, he figured all that he needed now was some hair to work on. So he paid the maid to go to the local barber shop and get hair from some young, strong, likely-looking customer. The problem was that the barber was on to what the maid was doing, since the mistress of the house had sent her to the shop before to get customers' hair for her magic spells. So the barber chased her out of the shop and out onto the street, where the maid saw a tuft of hair out on the street, and she scooped it up, not knowing who it was from. And my first lesson is to say simply what I think a lot of you already know, that if you want a job done right, you certainly have to do it yourself. So she brought the hair back to Lucius in exchange for a few coins, and he said a spell over it, and he felt his body changing, but not in the way that he expected. The hair in the street had not been from the barber shop. It had been left over from a fight that had broken out between two donkeys. And as you might expect, the donkey hair turned this young man into a donkey. The maid who was watching the young man perform this magic was at first shocked, and then she had a good laugh. She told Lucius that he could reverse the spell by eating a bunch of rosebuds. Now, Lucius was going to beg the maid to bring him some rosebuds, but all he could say was "Eeyore," and the maid, still laughing, left him there. Soon another servant found him out in the backyard and took him to the stable. And of course, Lucius tried to protest, but all he could do was say "Eeyore," and when he tried to explain his situation, the man just hit him over the head with a stick. The next day, the donkey was taken out of the stable with some other pack animals, and he was loaded up with gear to carry. And the second lesson today is about cruelty to animals, because Lucius found out in the story just how hard a donkey had to work. Roman humor is very much like the Three Stooges or something. It involves a lot of kicks and smacks over the head. And it was a long day for Lucius because he was getting a lot of those. And it was certainly not easy to find rosebuds to eat. Finally, the donkey saw roses on sale at a roadside fruit stand, but when he reached over to eat some, the store owner began hitting him over the head with a broom handle and drove him away. What happened next in the story was quite dramatic. Thieves came and killed those who were driving the pack animals in order to steal the gear that they were carrying. And the thieves then drove the donkeys away together with some other animals back to their hideout. On the way, the donkey saw some roses growing by the side of the road, and he was going to eat them. But then he realized that the thieves would kill him if he turned back into a human being before their eyes, since he had witnessed their crimes. So that with salvation within reach, he could not eat the roses, which would change him back into himself. Now, I realize this story has gone on quite a while already, and I don't have time to tell you how these, after various other adventures, the donkey was finally able to get some roses to eat and change back into Lucius. I'll simply say that our story is very similar. By the way we have lived, each of us has turned into something we shouldn't be. It's hard to change back now into what really we were meant to be. Sin does not turn us into donkeys, but if I may say so, it does turn us into jackasses. What undoes the spell for us is not, of course, a plate full of roses. It's something else which we find by hearing the voice of God, who calls out to us all our life long. There's a story called Vice Versa, which goes like this. Once upon a time in England, a boy was going off to boarding school, which meant he had to leave home and live at school, which was far away. And he had a hard time of it. The older boys bullied the younger ones. The classes were dull. He missed his friends back home and his dog. And on one of the few chances he got to get home, he said to his father that he didn't want to go to school, and he said how unhappy he was. And his father, who was reading the paper, didn't even look up from the newspaper and said, "Nonsense, best years of your life. Be glad you don't have to go to work the way I do." But the boy thought that the dad's life, working and having money in his pocket, sounded pretty good to him. Now, the father had just come back from India, which back in those days was a colony of England. And from India, he had brought with him a carved stone from an ancient temple. And what he hadn't realized was that the stone was like Aladdin's lamp. I mean, it granted you a wish when you held it in both hands. And what had happened when the boy was complaining to his father is that he had absent-mindedly picked up this stone and had said to his father, "I wish you had my life and I had yours." Well, because he was holding on to that stone, the wish came true, and in a flash, the boy found himself transported into his father's body and vice versa. And they couldn't figure out how to undo the wish because in this case, unlike Aladdin's lamp, he only got one wish. And the father, who now had a son's body, was trundled off to school, and the son, now a man, had to put on a suit and a little bowler cap, which is the kind of hat that businessmen wear in England, and take the train into the office in London. The old man, who had become a child again, found out that some things about childhood really were pretty good. Some foods, particularly desserts, tasted better now than, now that he was young than they had when he was a middle-aged man. And stories and incidents which would have struck him as silly as a grown-up, now when he was age 9, seemed very funny to him. But the bullying, the teasing, the being ordered about, never being taken seriously by any of the adults, the old man had forgotten all of that. And the young man, too, found that adulthood was a mix of good and bad. It was great to be the one who made the decisions, and he liked it when porters and cab drivers very respectfully referred to him as sir. But the workday stretched on, and as soon as one problem was solved at work, another came along. It wasn't always fun. It turned out that this wish was like the one the fairy godmother granted in Cinderella. It just wore off after a couple of hours, and the spell was gone. Suddenly they found themselves back in their old rules. But now at least the son understood his father better, and the father understood his son better. It's hard to judge another person, and it's silly to envy them. We don't really know what their life is like. So let's concentrate on living our own. Once upon a time, there was a miser who lived in a mansion at the edge of town. When the weather got cold in the autumn, mice would begin to come into his basement, and so the miser would get a stray cat, and the cat would chase the mice away. But once the mice were gone, the miser would throw the cat out the door, sometimes even when the weather was still very cold, because he didn't want to have to feed it. One autumn, the miser got a cat for this job as usual, but this cat was wise. He quickly caught the mouse, but instead of killing it, he said to the mouse, "Keep coming back, and I won't kill you. I'll just chase you around, and I'll give you food afterwards." The mouse would scramble around the house, make sure that the miser saw him, and the miser just figured he had a big mouse problem, and he would have to keep the cat so that the mouse would keep being chased away. Afterward, when the miser had gone off to bed, the cat would share his quiet meals with the mouse because the two of them were working together as a team. Sometimes the relationship between two supposed enemies is really a peculiar one. It turns out that they need each other. I hope you won't mind if I use a fancy word here. This is a symbiotic relationship. Symbiotic relationships actually are very common. Let me give you a couple of examples. The head of the palace guard will tell the king that the peasants are planning to revolt or that he might be assassinated, when in fact there really is no great danger. But providing security is a living for the palace guard, and it pays to have a very anxious king. Or to give you another example, fascism and communism both gained strength at the same time in the 1930s, since each was busy warning about the threat posed by the other, when in fact both of them were very bad ideas. There are always dangers in life, but sometimes it's important to separate the real dangers from those less serious ones, which are in fact the product of a symbiotic relationship. I'll tell you a story I heard once. There was a man who in his younger days wanted to travel, and at the time he really couldn't quite afford it, and he and his wife also didn't want to travel with their young daughter who was sickly with asthma, and so as a result they stayed close to home. Just when it came time for him to retire, his wife died. His daughter, who had gotten much better, was now working and married and had children of her own, urged her father now to go and see the world because he was much more prosperous now than he had been when he was young. But he said no, he didn't feel like traveling without his wife. He had a porcelain gnome out in his garden. It was an ugly thing, and to be honest, it's the kind of thing that most of us would have thrown away after a year or two. But because the gnome had been a gift from the man's wife, he didn't feel he could part with it. And one day the gnome disappeared from his garden. The man figured some mischievous kid in the neighborhood had stolen it. It wasn't valuable. He didn't give it any more thought. His daughter said, I don't know, since you're not traveling, maybe the gnome is traveling for you. The man laughed, but after about a week he received a letter in the mail. It had no return address. And inside there wasn't any letter, there was just a photograph, and it was a picture of the gnome with the Eiffel Tower in the background. And for the next few months, that would happen. I mean, every several weeks a letter would arrive in the mail. One day the gnome appeared with the Washington Monument in the background. Another week it would be in front of the Taj Mahal, or you would see Mount Fuji in the background. And the daughter didn't seem surprised. She'd just say, well, that gnome appears to be getting around. And the man looked at these pictures very closely, wondering if they were somehow trick photography, but they didn't seem to be. Then one day he discovered that one of his daughter's friends was an airline stewardess, and he realized the truth. The daughter's friend had been traveling around the world with this gnome in her luggage and sending pictures to him. And the man laughed, and he also decided maybe his daughter was right, and that maybe he would find a way of going on a few trips. There are quite a few things in life we put off, but if they are important, maybe we should decide if there's some way that we can do them now. Above all, that comes to be true when we're seeking salvation. Some people put that off, and God sends subtle reminders to us, a little bit like getting the picture of the gnome with a view in the background in the mail. Reminders that salvation should begin today. I remember once years ago talking to a friend. He and his wife were waiting to adopt a child, And they expected to wait a couple of years because that's usually how it works. But then one night, out of the blue, they got a call from the state which said, can you come and take your child now? They said, gee, we don't have a crib or a car seat or diapers or bottles or anything. And the state said, oh, that's fine. He'd be with foster parents overnight, and they gave him the address where they could find him in the morning. So that night they scrambled down to the store and they bought everything for a baby, and they made various arrangements at work. And then the next day they drove to the foster parents who greeted them kindly and wrapped the baby up in a blanket and gave them an extra diaper. And they were getting ready to take him, and the foster parents said, oh, wait a minute, this is his. And she pulled out a teddy bear. The child had no mom or dad, didn't own any clothes, didn't have anything except a teddy bear. That's what he had. You and I start out in this world with nothing. And on this Mother's Day weekend, I'll add that if we had parents who loved us, and whether they're biological or adoptive, then soon we had our own bed or a house to live in, and toys and friends and lots of wonderful things. And it's like that with God. We start with nothing. But through Jesus Christ, God can bring us to his house, which is full of riches. I couldn't describe those riches here any more than the infant in the story I told you about could have known what he would have in his home. We just have to go ourselves and see. Once upon a time, a general revolted against a king, and the two of them fought a great battle. The king was killed, and the general took the throne. The king had an infant daughter who would have been his successor, and as long as she was alive, she was therefore a threat to the general, so he sent his soldiers off to find and to kill her. The infant's nanny saw the soldiers coming to the door, so she grabbed the child and fled out the rear exit out into the desert. After days of walking, they had used up all their water. They were near death, but they were found by traveling nomads who kept sheep in the wilderness and never went to town. So the nanny joined that group. She ended up marrying one of the nomads, and they lived for some time as shepherds do. But at night, after they'd spent a day out in the taking the sheep in search of pasture or water, the nanny would tell the little girl about things that she hadn't seen, things like cities and chariot races and cheering crowds and theaters and the ocean, and of course about the palace that she once had lived in. Now the desert dwellers had never seen the city, and they'd never actually seen the ocean either. And some of the men took the little girl aside and said that her nanny was really making these things up, since the desert was the only world that they knew. And the little girl, picking sand off her food, as you always do in desert places, wondered what life must be like inside a building, or how strange it must be not to have to move every day. But the nanny died, and after years of living in the desert, she reached adulthood and decided there had never been such a thing as cities or roads or green lawns or whole forests of trees, and decided it had just been a tale that a nanny would tell to a child. This meant that she was also not a princess, and she decided that she was content with that. Then one day she was chasing a lamb which had climbed up onto a high hill, and when she got to the top, she could see the ocean off in the distance. And at that moment, she realized that the nanny had been telling her the truth. I have never been to the kingdom of Jesus Christ, but every once in a while I hear a song that is so beautiful, or see something in nature which is so true, so right, that it's like the girl looking off in the distance at the ocean and realizing that she was a princess after all and meant for another realm. I'll tell you a story I heard once from a friend of mine. When he was in high school, he and his cousin were hired by their uncle one summer to do lawn service work. The uncle had a lot of customers in Old Black Point and Niantic. Wealthy customers, which is good, they could pay the bill, but also fussy, which meant you had to do the job carefully. It was a big lawn they were doing that day, and this story happened decades ago when people were still using push mowers, so it took a couple of hours. They were doing a job for a customer who traveled a lot, and they were told she was out of town on one of her trips. They mowed her yard on a very hot, humid day. When they finished, they looked over at her swimming pool. The two of them exchanged a glance, and soon both of them were skinny dipping in the pool. Perfect end of a demanding job. Really enjoying themselves, and after a few minutes of that, they heard the screech of a vehicle in the driveway. It was their uncle. The owner was not away on a trip. She was home. She'd called the uncle. He'd driven right over. I'm not going to dwell on the next few minutes, which were very unpleasant, ending with the two of them losing their job and walking home from Niantic on the hottest day of the summer. Someday our lives will end, and we'll stand in the presence of Jesus Christ. My message today is simple. When that happens, let's make sure we're found doing our job and not doing something we weren't supposed to. Once upon a time, the king was out hunting. He saw a deer that was white all over, and that was a curious sight. He chased it for many miles. And finally, the deer stopped and looked back over its shoulder at him, and the king drew his crossbow and prepared to fire, and his servant was quite alarmed and tried to stop him, saying, "Sire, it's forbidden to shoot the white deer." And then the king didn't listen, and when he raised up the bow and shot it, the king disappeared because the white deer was enchanted. And the story was that the king was now a captive in the castle of fears, and that he would remain there until someone who was brave enough and worthy enough came along to set him free. So what the queen did was she sent her two best servants out to get the king. The first was a mighty warrior. The second was the court physician, who was regarded as the smartest person in the realm. Between brains and brawn, the queen figured she had everything covered. She also sent with them a young servant who would cook and clean up after them. So the three went out into the wilderness. They came upon a dwarf who was warming his hands by the fire, and they asked him how to get to the castle of fears. He gave them directions, but he said, "If you doubt your courage, go no further." And once he said that, he gradually disappeared before their eyes, like the Cheshire Cat. The warrior began to sweat. He could face any enemy, but he was afraid of ghosts. Then they came to a seashore, and a boat came to pick them up, but no one was sailing the vessel. And the knight could take no more. He turned and fled. So the physician and the cook went on alone. When they reached the castle of fears, the path that ran to the front door ran along a very steep edge. There was a very steep drop on one side, very narrow road too. And the physician was afraid of heights, so she could go no further either. And though the cook did not regard himself as any kind of hero, he was able to deal with heights just as he had not been afraid of ghosts. And he realized that after all, there was no one left besides him now. And there were other attempts to frighten him. It was a castle of strange and sudden noises. It was dark inside. I think most of us are uneasy in the dark. There were masks on the walls which had eyes which followed him when he wasn't looking, and suits of armor that would change position when he would turn around and he would see they were in a different position than before. But the cook kept going throughout the castle until finally he found the king's room. And because he had not been stopped by his fears, the spell was broken and he took the king home. Courage is found in unexpected places. This is Memorial Day, and today we not only remember that some have sacrificed their lives, but also that they overcame in the process many fears which are common to us all. I hope no one listening to this now ever has to become a hero in war, but we all need to show courage at certain times in our lives. Back in the days of slavery, just a few years actually before this church was built, Frederick Douglass was a slave working in a shipyard in Maryland. Slaves were forbidden by law from learning how to read, but Douglass decided to learn anyway. When he was bringing timbers from the carpenter shop out to the place where the boat was being assembled, each piece of wood was marked with two letters to show where it went. LF meant larboard front, or as we landlubbers would say front left. SR meant starboard rear. This was how he began to learn the alphabet. From there, he learned how to read short messages. He'd look at a sign and he would say to a white child, "What does that say?" Or even, "I bet you can't read that." Sometimes they couldn't read it either, but sometimes, in order, for example, to win a small bet, a child would tell him what the sign said, and he began to learn how to read. Soon he was secretly reading the morning paper in his master's house, and he practiced with a piece of coal how to write, because, as it turned out, he had a plan. Masters sometimes loaned their slaves to other masters to work on their estates. And the slaves would carry a letter from the master stating where they were going, because when slaves were on the roads by themselves, they were always stopped and questioned. Douglas decided to escape to freedom, so he wrote a letter which pretended to give him permission to go to an estate further north. He was stopped many times, but since no one expected a slave to read, no one realized that the letter he produced was written by Douglas himself, who always at these moments when he was being stopped pretended to be particularly slow-witted. In this way, he gradually made his way north to freedom. Sometimes I think of all the books that we have at home and all the others that are available free for us at the library or online, which we have access to, but which we don't even bother to look at. And I think of Frederick Douglass. Anything that comes easily, we tend to take for granted. This is also true of the salvation which comes through Jesus Christ. Just because Bibles are on our bookshelf and churches are not far away, let's not make the mistake of overlooking it. Henry James wrote a story called The Jolly Corner, which went like this. A man grew up in New York City, but after inheriting some money, he decided to live in Europe and put his house up there for rent. And he was in Europe about 20 years, living in various places, not needing a regular job because of the money he had inherited, and working as a writer, which, by the way, was just about what Henry James himself did. He hoped to have good rents coming in from his house in New York City, but he was disappointed. No one seemed to stay in the apartment very long. He wrote and asked the property manager of the building, gee, what was going on? And the manager replied that the place was haunted. So the writer decided to go home and check this out. And when he got to this country, he went back to the building, which is the one he had grown up in, and he went there both to relive his own childhood and also to see if that old building actually needed any repairs, and that had been what was keeping people from living there. He saw a few things that required some work. He talked to some carpenters about it. Usually, he was one of those sort of impractical people who felt kind of at a loss when he was conducting business, but for some reason, he was beginning to feel a little more efficient. He'd had a better eye for problems than he'd expected to have, and he was able to get the carpenters to come sooner and work for less than he had expected. So I somehow felt different now that he was there. He decided to stay in the apartment for a while, since after all it was empty, to check out the ghost stories he had heard. And as he did feel the presence of another person, even though, of course, he was there all by himself. Usually ghost stories are scary, but somehow this other person he was running into or seeing out of the corner of his eye was someone that he was more curious about than afraid of. He couldn't seem to summon up any fear of this thing, but he certainly wanted to know more about it. And when he saw the specter from the corner of his eye, he could tell by what he saw of the ghost that it too was curious about him, as curious about him as he was about it. It would disappear for a while when he looked straight at it, but gradually it began to stay into view a little longer, looking intently at him. And he realized when he saw the ghost, it was like looking in a mirror, as if he'd had an identical twin. And it slowly dawned on him, because other things about his life had been starting to feel a little different and to change a little. It began to dawn on him that the place was haunted by the type of person he would have become had he not inherited a fortune and lived abroad. One thing he realized about his double is that it was more skilled in money and business, because his image had stayed in New York and somehow made his way in the world. And now that he was back in this apartment that, of course, he had grown up in, some of this ability was starting to rub off on him. He looked at this ghost's hand and he saw that it was missing two fingers. He worked up the nerve to ask the ghost what had happened, and the ghost whispered back, "The war." The writer, like Henry James himself, had avoided the Civil War, but the ghost had served and apparently been wounded. He realized it was leading the ghost that he himself might have led if he had stayed there. And the man saw that, as curious as he was about the ghost was also just as curious about him and what he had done with his life. And so he had told the ghost all that he did, the various places he'd seen in the world, the stories he'd written up, the world's great cities that he'd become acquainted with. And the ghost was interested. His double had lived differently, but he liked what he had done. And when he left the apartment, the house was haunted no longer. If you think about it, there's a lot of different people that we could have been or that we could still yet be. If we lose our temper a lot and throw our weight around, it will mean that we're rude. But if we have good manners and keep our temper, it will mean that we're a polite person. We can be a little sharp in our dealings, or on the other hand, we can be scrupulously honest. We can be extravagant, or on the other hand, we can be thrifty. If we don't care about school, we will end up ignorant, at least as far as book learning goes. If we work hard, we will be knowledgeable. Clearly, there's some choices in life that we'll want to take and other ones that really we will want to avoid. What I've been telling you in the Jolly Corner is, of course, just a story. But there's no use explaining to some other potential self someday, like the ghost that Henry James runs into in his story. No sense having to explain to someone why you didn't live differently. I agree that running into a double of ourselves who has lived differently is not very likely to happen. But if it does happen, let's make sure that the ghost is satisfied with every one of the decisions that we've made. Once upon a time, people were called by just one name, and after a while it got confusing because there were so many people named John or Mary or Robert or Mark or Elizabeth that it became important to distinguish them. The last names that they were given, the other name they got, reflected one of two things. Sometimes it described the job that some distant ancestor of ours worked at. And I think you've probably met people with names like Baker or Weaver. I had relatives named Wainwright, which is someone who made a wagon wheel. I think you knew that someone named Smith, you go back far enough, that there was somebody who was a blacksmith, and a miller was someone who ground grain to make flour. A crocker was someone who sold pottery. A sawyer sawed up wood at the lumber mill, and a carter or a porter was someone who hauled things around the way that truckers do now. On the other hand, the second type of name described where people were from. My last name probably means that one of my ancestors was living in England but was originally from Scotland. Lots of other names indicated a small town that someone may have come from. For example, Washington and Lincoln are both villages in England, so both of those presidents must once upon a time have relatives that came from there. But really there's a much more important way that we come to be known, and that is by the type of person that we are. We want to be honest so that when we walk by, people say, "There goes an honest person." We want to work hard so that people say, "There goes a hard worker." It's a good question to ask, what do we want to be known for? Or to even better question to ask, how does God know us? As a slippery character or as a stalwart friend? And at the end of our days, we want God to be able to say to us, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." I remember there was a senior citizen I visited many years ago who could not get to the point. I'd ask her a simple question, which probably could have been answered in one or two sentences, and she would go on and on until my eyes glazed over, and it was because she could omit no detail. If I asked her how she became a school teacher, she'd replied her mother wanted her to be a nurse, but her father disagreed and said that a woman's place was in the home. But when she was in high school, her best friend said that she might apply to the teacher's college. She wasn't going to do that because in those days teachers had to resign when they got married, but she figured that with the summer vacations that she might have a chance to travel. And she'd known lots of people who wanted to see the country but never could because, they hadn't had time to take a trip, and teachers had the time. But the trouble was going in the summer like a teacher meant that it's hard to visit hot places, and she'd always wanted to visit the Grand Canyon. And, she'd go on like this, and at some point she could see that she was starting to lose me. As I say, my eyes would start to glaze over. But then, instead of omitting any detail, what she would do, she would start to talk faster. Now, the great hero Aeneas faced the same problem when he was trying to establish the city of Rome, and he was lost in the Mediterranean Sea. There was no GPS in those days. There was no convenience store clerk that you could drop by and ask where Rome was. Instead, he was told in a prophecy that if he went to the land of the dead, he could seek out an old sailor who had died many years before and who knew the way to get there, which was very tricky. The problem was that once he got past the gates of Hades, he'd only have one day to find him, and if he stayed more than one day, he wouldn't be able to get back out again, and he would be trapped forever in the land of the dead. So he'd have to move fast, because Hades is a big place, and it would take a while to find this sailor. So Aeneas entered the gates of death, which were guarded by the three-headed dog Cerberus, and he was tempted to stare at this unusual dog. I mean, how many three-headed dogs have you seen today? But he knew he had to hurry. So the next thing he saw were various celebrities who were milling around in Hades and were talking with each other. He was tempted to go over and strike up a conversation with them. After all, if you had the chance to talk to Da Vinci or Napoleon or Thomas Jefferson, wouldn't you be interested? But Aeneas realized that he had to look for that old sailor, so he walked right past them and kept looking. Then he saw both his father, Anchises, and his own wife, Creusa, who had both predeceased him. Naturally, he wanted to go over and talk to them. He missed them very much. Don't all of us have someone we dearly wish we could see again and talk to again like that, who is now in the land of the dead? But he realized that if he spent time with them, he would not be able to find the old sailor and not be able to find his way to Rome. This was an even bigger temptation, but he remained true to the mission, and in the story he found the old sailor and got directions on how to sail to Rome. Jesus said that the way is hard which leads to life. This is Matthew 7:14. We have a limited time in this world, and we wouldn't want to miss eternity. So here is a case where we really need to get to the point, to find out what's important, the grace of God, and take a beeline right toward it. I'll tell you a story from the days of ancient Greece. In the 4th century BC, a man named Herostratus wanted to become famous. And he was not an athlete or an artist or a general or a politician, so how could he become famous? How could he become a celebrity? Well, he realized that you could become famous just as much by doing something bad as by doing something good. And so it was that he set fire to the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. After he did this, a law was passed forbidding anyone to even mention his name orally or in writing, which showed that for a while he really was the talk of the town and really was quite famous. So too in our own history, there are many who have become famous by their bad behavior, so that if I reeled off the names of Nero or Hitler or John Wilkes Booth or Lee Harvey Oswald or Al Capone, I mean, all of you would know who I meant. On the other hand, there's all sorts of great people in history who are anonymous. Who discovered fire? Who first domesticated the horse or the dog? Who wrote books of the Bible like Judges or Ruth or Job? Who built and paid for the schools that we attended when we were young, or for that matter, the church that we worship in right now? All of which shows it's not important if we become well known. Bad people like Herostratus are remembered in this world, while great individuals are often forgotten. What matters is if our name is written in what the book of Revelation, as is Revelation 17:8, calls the book of life. That's the goal we want to reach.